The summer of 1845 hung heavy over Caldwell County, Georgia, like a sodden woolen blanket. Heat shimmered across the red clay roads, distorting the landscape into wavering mirages that made travelers question their own eyes. Twin Oaks Plantation stood proudly amid this sweltering atmosphere, its white columns gleaming like bleached bones against the dense green backdrop of oak and pine. The main house sat atop a gentle rise, overlooking acres of cotton fields, where dozens of enslaved people toiled beneath the merciless sun. Elizabeth Montgomery, mistress of Twin Oaks, watched from the shade of her veranda, a glass of sweet tea perspiring in her hand, just as her porcelain skin did beneath her fine muslin dress. At 32, she possessed a beauty that had survived the birth of 3 children and the harsh southern climate. Pale skin that refused to freckle, auburn hair with natural ringlets that framed a heart-shaped face, and eyes the color of Spanish moss. Her small mouth, however, was set in a permanent downward curve, as though disappointment had carved itself into her features. "Esther!" she called, her voice carrying across the front yard. "Bring me my parasol. I must visit the overseer." From the shadowy interior of the house emerged Esther, a woman of about Elizabeth's age, though her face and hands showed the weathering of one who had spent her life working under Georgia's unforgiving sun. She moved with measured grace, her eyes cast downward as she handed over the lace-trimmed parasol. "Will there be anything else, Miss Elizabeth?" Esther's voice was quiet but clear, revealing no emotion. "No, but have supper prepared by 6. Reverend Caldwell is joining us this evening." "Ah!" Elizabeth didn't wait for a response as she descended the steps, her skirts rustling with the sound of expensive fabric against expensive fabric. As Elizabeth disappeared down the path toward the fields, Esther's gaze followed her, finally allowing the hatred she kept carefully masked to surface in her dark eyes. She had served the Montgomery family since she was 8 years old, first as a playmate to Elizabeth, then as her personal maid, after Elizabeth's marriage to Thomas Montgomery 15 years ago. Now she served as head house slave, managing the household while raising her own daughter Mercy, who at 12 had already begun training as a house servant. Inside the kitchen, separated from the main house by a covered walkway to keep cooking heat from the family's living quarters, Mercy was helping the cook, Ida, prepare vegetables for the evening meal. "Your mama's got that look again," Ida murmured, her knife rhythmically chopping through a pile of okra. At 55, Ida had seen 3 generations of Montgomerys come and go. Her hands were gnarled from arthritis, but she still maintained her position as cook through sheer force of will and the knowledge that no one else could reproduce her recipes. "What look?" Mercy asked, though she knew exactly what Ida meant. "That looked like she planning something, like she seeing things nobody else can see." Ida shook her head. "Never good when your mama gets quiet like that." Mercy said nothing, focusing instead on the carrots she was peeling. She had inherited her mother's ability to conceal her thoughts, a survival skill passed down through generations of enslaved people. But inside, she worried. Her mother had indeed been different lately, quieter, more watchful, slipping away at odd hours of the night. On the far side of the plantation, past the cotton fields where backs bent under the Georgia sun, Thomas Montgomery was inspecting a new parcel of land with his overseer, Jacob Miller. Thomas was a tall man with a physique that had once been athletic but had softened with age and prosperity. At 45, his sandy hair was receding and a paunch strained against his waistcoat. Unlike many plantation owners who left the daily management to others, Thomas took an active interest in Twin Oaks operations. "This area would be ideal for expanding next season," Miller said, gesturing to the tree line. "We could clear another 20 acres, add at least 15 more field hands." Thomas nodded, calculating profits and expenses in his head. "The market for cotton remains strong. With the right investment now, we could double our output within 3 years. If you don't mind my saying so, sir, you might consider purchasing younger stock this time. The last group you bought from Willoughby included too many older ones. They don't last in this heat." Thomas frowned slightly. He considered himself a practical businessman, rather than cruel, but he knew Miller was right. "Speak to Fletcher in Savannah. He usually has fresh arrivals from Africa, despite the ban. Healthier, though they require more breaking in." Neither man noticed the small figure concealed behind a massive oak tree just beyond the clearing. Isaac, one of the young stable boys, had been sent to deliver a message, but stopped when he heard the men talking. At 14, he understood exactly what their conversation meant. More land cleared meant more work. More stock meant more people torn from their homes, their families. And breaking in meant whips and chains and crushed spirits. Isaac backed away silently, then turned and ran through the woods rather than take the main path. He needed to tell the others what he'd heard. As he raced through the trees, the branches catching at his rough cotton shirt, he nearly collided with Elizabeth Montgomery. "Boy, what are you doing out here?" Her voice cracked like a whip, making him stumble to a halt. "I'm sorry, Miss Elizabeth. Mr. Miller sent me to find the master, but I got turned around." The lie came easily to his lips, his eyes appropriately downcast. Elizabeth studied him for a moment, suspicion evident in her gaze. "The stables are in the opposite direction. Return there immediately." "Yes, ma'am." Isaac bowed slightly before hurrying away, feeling her eyes boring into his back. As Isaac disappeared among the trees, Elizabeth continued her walk, her mind preoccupied. The encounter with the boy was already forgotten as she contemplated the evening ahead. Reverend Caldwell's visit was more than a social call. The minister had been showing increasing interest in her charitable work with the county's poor white families, and Elizabeth suspected he might be developing personal feelings for her as well. The thought brought a small smile to her lips. Thomas had been a disappointment as a husband, interested only in expanding his wealth and his land, indifferent to her intellectual pursuits and spiritual questions. The Reverend, on the other hand, engaged her in theological discussions, recommended books, and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts. Elizabeth's musings were interrupted as she arrived at the small family cemetery nestled in a grove of ancient oaks. Generations of Montgomerys rested here, their graves marked by elaborate headstones and statuary. She paused before the newest addition, a small marble angel marking the final resting place of her infant son, William, who had lived just 3 days the previous winter. She knelt, unconcerned about the dirt that would stain her dress, and placed her hand on the cool stone. "I haven't forgotten my promise to you," she whispered. "Things will change here. They must." As twilight descended over Twin Oaks, the household prepared for dinner. In the dining room, candles cast a warm glow over the polished mahogany table set with the Montgomery family's finest china and silver. Esther moved silently around the room, making final adjustments to place settings, while Mercy stood ready by the door to assist with serving. Elizabeth, now dressed in a deep blue gown that accentuated her fair complexion, entered the room just as Thomas arrived from his study. "You look lovely this evening," he commented, more from habit than genuine observation. "Thank you." Elizabeth's response was equally perfunctory. "Reverend Caldwell should be here momentarily." As if on cue, they heard the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. Minutes later, Jeremiah Caldwell was being ushered into the drawing room by Samuel, the elderly butler. The Reverend was younger than most would expect for his position, barely 40, with an intensity in his dark eyes that spoke of deep conviction. His black clerical clothes were impeccably maintained, despite the modest salary the church provided. "Mrs. Montgomery, you are radiant as always." The Reverend took Elizabeth's offered hand, holding it perhaps a moment longer than propriety dictated. "Mr. Montgomery, I trust you're well?" Thomas nodded, gesturing toward the decanter on the sideboard. "Brandy before dinner, Reverend?" "Just a small one, thank you." As Thomas poured the drinks, Elizabeth engaged the minister in conversation. "I've been reading that book you recommended, Reverend. Emerson's Essays. I find his ideas quite provocative." "Indeed." Caldwell's eyebrows rose slightly, though many consider his views on traditional Christianity to be rather unorthodox. Perhaps that's what makes them worth considering," Elizabeth replied, her voice low enough that Thomas, still at the sideboard, couldn't hear. "Orthodoxy rarely changes anything." The Reverend studied her face, trying to decipher her meaning, but before he could respond, Samuel announced that dinner was served. Throughout the meal, Elizabeth directed the conversation toward religious matters, the Church's position on various social issues, interpretations of Scripture, the role of faith in everyday life. Thomas contributed little, his interests lying more in business and politics than theology. By the time dessert was served, the Reverend was fully engaged in explaining his views on baptism and salvation. "The ritual itself is merely symbolic, of course," he explained, warming to his subject. "It's the inward conversion that truly matters." "But surely the symbol has power," Elizabeth countered, leaning forward slightly. "Otherwise, why would we continue to perform it?" "Tradition, community, shared experience." The Reverend sipped his wine. "These things bind us together as Christians." "And who decides who may participate in these binding rituals?" Elizabeth asked, her voice suddenly sharper. Thomas glanced up from his plate, sensing the shift in his wife's tone. "The Church has established guidelines based on Scripture and tradition," Reverend Caldwell replied carefully. "One must profess faith, demonstrate understanding of Christian principles, and live accordingly. And if one is denied the opportunity to profess such faith, to demonstrate such understanding—" Elizabeth's eyes held the minister's. "What then?" An uncomfortable silence descended on the dining room. Esther, who had been standing against the wall, felt her heart beat faster as she recognized the dangerous territory Elizabeth was entering. "I believe you're referring to the instruction of slaves in Christian principles," Reverend Caldwell finally said, his voice measured. "The diocese encourages religious education appropriate to their station and capacity for understanding." "Their capacity?" Elizabeth's laugh held no humor. "They understand suffering and injustice perfectly well, Reverend, perhaps better than those who sit in your pews each Sunday." "Elizabeth," Thomas's voice carried a warning, "the Reverend is our guest." She ignored her husband. "Would you baptize a slave who professed genuine faith, Reverend? Would you welcome them into full communion with your congregation?" The minister dabbed his lips with his napkin before responding. "There are separate services held for the colored people, Mrs. Montgomery, as you well know." "Yes, held in the basement after the white congregation has gone home, with a separate communion set and different hymns. Tell me, Reverend, does Christ maintain separate heavens as well?" "That's enough, Elizabeth." Thomas's fist came down on the table, causing the silverware to jump. "You'll excuse my wife, Reverend. She's been unwell lately. The summer heat affects her nerves." Elizabeth's gaze shifted to her husband, her eyes cold. How convenient that women and slaves share the same affliction, nerves that prevent us from speaking uncomfortable truths. The atmosphere in the room had become suffocating. Mercy, standing by the door, wanted desperately to look at her mother, to gauge her reaction, but she kept her eyes fixed on the floor as she'd been taught. Reverend Caldwell cleared his throat. "Perhaps I should take my leave. It's growing late." "Nonsense," Thomas said quickly. "We haven't discussed the church-building fund. I had planned to make a contribution. Money, the universal language that could smooth over even the most awkward social situations." The Reverend hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, though perhaps Mrs. Montgomery might wish to retire if she's feeling unwell." "I'm perfectly well," Elizabeth stated flatly, "but I'll leave you gentlemen to your business matters. Good night, Reverend." She stood, not waiting for the men to rise as etiquette demanded, and swept from the room. As she passed Esther, their eyes met for the briefest moment, an electric connection that no one else observed. Then Elizabeth was gone, leaving behind a tension that hung in the air like the distant promise of a storm. Later that night, As the house settled into silence, Esther made her way to the small cabin she shared with Mercy and two other house slaves. The night was thick with humidity, fireflies punctuating the darkness with their ephemeral glow. From the direction of the slave quarters, she could hear the soft sounds of a spiritual being sung, voices kept low, but carrying emotion that transcended volume. Inside the cabin, Mercy was already asleep on their shared pallet, her breathing deep and even. Esther watched her daughter for a moment, her heart constricting with both love and fear. Mercy was growing into a beautiful young woman, her skin the color of burnished copper, her features delicate. Beauty was a dangerous gift for an enslaved girl. Esther moved to a loose floorboard in the corner of the room and carefully pried it up. From the hidden space beneath, she removed a small packet wrapped in oilcloth. Unwrapping it revealed a folded piece of paper and a crude map drawn on a scrap of cotton cloth. She studied these items by the dim light of a single candle, committing details to memory before returning them to their hiding place. Outside, an owl called into the night, its cry like a question that went unanswered. Esther extinguished the candle and lay down beside her daughter, her eyes open and watchful in the darkness. Across the plantation, in her elegantly appointed bedroom, Elizabeth Montgomery also lay awake. The encounter with Reverend Caldwell had not gone as planned. She had hoped to guide him gradually toward her way of thinking, to use his influence in the community to support her increasingly radical ideas. Instead, she had revealed too much too soon, and likely alienated him. She turned on her side, looking out the window at the same moon that shone down on the slave quarters. The divide between her world and theirs seemed both vast and paper-thin. A matter of circumstance, of birth, nothing more. This realization had been growing within her since the death of her infant son, a tragedy that had cracked open her carefully constructed worldview and allowed doubt to seep in. If God could take her innocent child, what other injustices might he permit? Or perhaps it wasn't God who created these injustices at all, but men who twisted faith to justify their own power and wealth. Elizabeth closed her eyes, her decision crystallizing in her mind. If change wouldn't come through the church's established channels, she would forge her own path. The consequences would be severe. She harbored no illusions about that. But she had already lost what she valued most, what remained to fear. As both women drifted into uneasy sleep on opposite sides of the plantation, neither knew that their separate plans were about to collide, setting in motion events that would forever alter Twin Oaks and everyone who called it home. Dawn broke reluctantly over Twin Oaks, the rising sun obscured by a bank of heavy clouds that promised rain later in the day. The plantation came alive with movement, field slaves making their way to the cotton rows, house slaves beginning their daily routines of cooking, cleaning, and tending to the family's needs. In the kitchen, Ida was already at work, kneading dough for the day's bread while instructing Mercy on preparing breakfast for the Montgomerys. "Take care with the master's eggs," she warned. "You know he likes the yolks just so, not too firm and not too runny. Miss Elizabeth takes hers with toast, no butter, and a slice of tomato when we have them." Mercy nodded, concentrating on her task. She had been up since before first light, her mother shaking her awake with unusual urgency. "Something's coming," Esther had whispered, her face close to Mercy's in the pre-dawn darkness. "I don't know what, but I can feel it. Keep your eyes and ears open today. If anything unusual happens, anything at all, you find a way to let me know." Now, as Mercy prepared the breakfast trays, she wondered what her mother had meant. Esther worked primarily in the main house, supervising the other house slaves and attending directly to Elizabeth's needs. They would cross paths several times throughout the day, but opportunities for private conversation would be limited. In the dining room, Thomas Montgomery sat at the head of the table, reviewing account books while he waited for his wife to join him. The previous evening's uncomfortable dinner with Reverend Caldwell had left him irritated. Elizabeth's behavior was becoming increasingly unpredictable, her comments about slavery and religion bordering on dangerous. He would need to speak with her firmly about maintaining appropriate attitudes, especially in front of others. When Elizabeth finally entered the dining room, Thomas was struck by her appearance. Instead of her usual morning dress, she wore a simple dark blue gown, more suited to church attendance. Her hair was pulled back severely from her face, and she wore no jewelry save her wedding band. "You're dressed for an outing," he observed as Samuel poured coffee for them both. "Yes, I plan to visit the widow Parker this morning. Her youngest child is ill." Elizabeth buttered a piece of toast with precise movements, not meeting her husband's gaze. Thomas frowned. "The Parkers are tenant farmers, barely one step above white trash. Surely you could send Ida with some broth or medicine." "The child needs more than broth, Thomas. She needs compassion, as does her mother." Elizabeth's voice was cool. "Besides, I find these visits enlightening. Not everyone lives as we do." "That's precisely my point," Thomas replied. "You're a Montgomery now. You have a position to maintain in this community. And what position is that exactly? Ornamental wife, hostess, mother to dead children." The bitterness in her voice was raw, surprising them both. Thomas set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "I understand you're still grieving for William. We both are. But these excursions of yours, these radical ideas, they must stop. You embarrassed me in front of Reverend Caldwell last night." "I embarrassed you?" Elizabeth gave a short, humorless laugh. "Heaven forbid I should express an original thought in the presence of men." "This isn't about original thought, Elizabeth. It's about propriety and respect for our way of life. Our way of life." She repeated the phrase slowly, as if examining each word. "Built on the backs of people we own like furniture. Tell me, Thomas, have you ever considered the moral implications of what we do?" Thomas's face darkened. "I've considered the practical implications of maintaining this plantation, providing for our family, contributing to our community. That's my responsibility as a man and as a Christian." "As a Christian?" Elizabeth's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, of course. How convenient that Christianity can be interpreted to justify whatever serves our interests." Thomas pushed back from the table, his appetite gone. "I don't know what's happened to you, Elizabeth. You've changed." "Yes," she agreed quietly. "I have." For a moment, they stared at each other across the table, the gulf between them wider than the physical distance. Then Thomas stood. "I have business in town today. I expect you to be home when I return, and I expect this conversation to resume then, with a more reasonable attitude on your part." He left without waiting for her response, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor as he strode from the room. Elizabeth remained seated, her breakfast untouched, her eyes fixed on the window that overlooked the front lawn where Thomas would soon emerge on his way to the stables. Samuel, who had been standing silently against the wall throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "Will there be anything else, Miss Elizabeth?" "No, Samuel. Thank you." Her voice was distant, distracted. The elderly butler hesitated, then ventured, "If I might say, Miss Elizabeth, the master means well. He worries for you, especially since young Master William's passing." Elizabeth's gaze shifted to Samuel, really seeing him for perhaps the first time in years. He had been with the Montgomery family since before she married into it, his once black hair now completely grey, his tall frame slightly stooped with age. How much had those eyes witnessed over the decades? How many conversations had those ears overheard as he stood invisibly in the background of white lives? "How old are you, Samuel?" she asked suddenly. Surprise flickered across his face at the unexpected question. "I believe I'm 67 this year, Miss Elizabeth, though the exact date is uncertain." "And in all those years, has anyone ever asked what you think, what you feel, what you believe?" Samuel's expression became carefully neutral. "It's not my place to have opinions on my master's affairs, Miss Elizabeth." "But you do have them." "As you say, ma'am." His eyes dropped to the floor, the gesture both respectful and self-protective. Elizabeth studied him for a moment longer, then sighed. "You may go, Samuel. Please send Esther to my room. I'll need her help to prepare for my visit to the Parkers." As Samuel left the dining room, Elizabeth remained at the table, lost in thought. Through the window, she watched Thomas mount his horse and ride down the oak-lined drive toward the main road. Something had broken between them, perhaps irreparably. But that wasn't her primary concern now. She had made her decision, and after weeks of careful preparation, today would be the day she acted upon it. In the kitchen, Samuel delivered Elizabeth's request for Esther, then made his way to the small room off the pantry where he slept. Once alone, he closed the door and knelt beside his bed, his old knees protesting the hard floor. From beneath the thin mattress, he withdrew a small leather pouch. Inside was a crude cross made of twisted wire, a symbol of his private faith, one that differed in significant ways from the religion preached in the white churches. Samuel held the cross to his chest and closed his eyes. "Lord," he whispered, "trouble's coming. I can feel it in these old bones. Whatever it is, whatever happens, protect those who can't protect themselves." He didn't specify who those people might be. God would know. Upstairs in Elizabeth's bedroom, Esther was helping her mistress prepare for her supposed visit to the Parker family. As she fastened the buttons on Elizabeth's cloak, she noticed the woman's unusual tension. "You seem anxious this morning, Miss Elizabeth. Is something troubling you?" Elizabeth met Esther's gaze in the mirror. "Many things trouble me, Esther. Things I've been blind to for too long." There was something in her tone that made Esther's skin prickle with apprehension. She had known Elizabeth since childhood, had watched her transform from a spoiled, carefree girl to a woman hardened by disappointment and loss. And this new Elizabeth, with her sharp questions and restless energy, was yet another metamorphosis, one Esther couldn't quite decipher. "I've noticed you slipping away at night," Elizabeth said abruptly, still watching Esther in the mirror. 3 times in the past month. Esther's hands froze on the cloak buttons. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face revealed nothing. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Elizabeth." "Don't you?" Elizabeth turned to face her directly. "I've always been a light sleeper. Since William died, I barely sleep at all. I see things others don't notice, like you leaving your cabin after midnight, returning before dawn with mud on your skirts." Terror flooded Esther's veins, but she remained outwardly calm. "Sometimes I walk when I can't sleep. The night air helps clear my head." "Is that all?" Elizabeth stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper despite the fact that they were alone. "Or are you meeting someone? Perhaps delivering messages?" Esther's mind raced. If Elizabeth suspected her involvement with the Underground Railroad, it could mean disaster, not just for her, but for dozens of others, both enslaved and free, who formed the secret network. Punishment would be severe, whipping at the very least, possibly sailed to the Deep South, separating her from mercy forever. For the white abolitionists who helped, it could mean imprisonment or worse. "I don't know what you're implying, Miss Elizabeth," Esther finally said, her voice steady despite her fear. Elizabeth studied her for a long moment, then turned away. "No, I don't suppose you do." She moved to her dressing table and opened a drawer, removing a small leather-bound book. "Do you know what this is?" Esther glanced at it cautiously. "It appears to be a Bible, ma'am." "It is. My mother gave it to me when I was confirmed at 12 years old. For 20 years I've read it dutifully, accepting the interpretations I was taught without question." Elizabeth ran her fingers over the worn cover. "But lately, I've been reading it differently, seeing passages I never truly noticed before. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." She looked up at Esther, her eyes intense. "Do you believe in God, Esther?" The question was like a trap, with danger on every side. If she admitted to Christian faith, she might be exposing herself to accusations of overstepping her place. If she denied it, she could be labeled a heathen in need of salvation, which often meant more control, more restrictions. I believe in a power greater than any man, Esther answered carefully. A smile touched Elizabeth's lips. A diplomatic answer, but not what I asked. She set the Bible down and picked up her gloves. Never mind. Your faith is your own business, as it should be for everyone. She paused, then added, I won't be visiting the Parkers today. I have another destination in mind, and I want you to accompany me. Esther felt her unease grow. Where are we going, Miss Elizabeth? To the river. Elizabeth pulled on her gloves with deliberate movements. I need a witness for what I'm about to do. D. The river that bordered the western edge of the Montgomery property was swollen from recent rains, its normally lazy current transformed into a rushing torrent of muddy water. The sky had darkened further as Elizabeth and Esther made their way along the narrow path that led from the main house through a stand of willows to the riverbank. Elizabeth had insisted they go alone, without a driver or escort, which was unusual enough to fuel Esther's growing anxiety. More concerning still was the bag Elizabeth carried, a canvas sack whose contents clinked softly with each step. They reached a small clearing by the water's edge where local churches sometimes conducted baptisms during the drier months. Now, the baptismal spot was submerged beneath several feet of turbulent water. Elizabeth set down her bag and turned to face Esther. What I'm about to do may seem strange to you, but I ask that you bear witness without judgment. Yes, Miss Elizabeth. Esther's response was automatic, though her mind was racing with questions and fears. From the bag, Elizabeth removed several items. A silver cup that Esther recognized as part of the Montgomery family's communion set, a small crystal decanter of wine, and a linen cloth embroidered with crosses, all items that belonged in a church, not on a muddy riverbank. When William died, Elizabeth began, arranging the items on a flat stone, something broke inside me. Not just my heart as a mother, but my understanding of the world. I had done everything right, married well, maintained a respectable home, attended church faithfully. I had followed every rule set before me by family, church, and society, and still God took my child. She uncorked the decanter, the sharp smell of wine carrying on the humid air. For months I was angry. I questioned everything I had been taught about divine justice and mercy. How could a loving God allow such suffering? Not just mine, but the suffering I see around me every day. In the quarters, in the fields, in the eyes of children born into bondage. Esther remained silent, understanding that Elizabeth wasn't really speaking to her, but working through her own thoughts aloud. Then one night, I began reading the Bible again, not as a dutiful Christian woman, but as a grieving mother seeking answers. And what I found shocked me. Elizabeth poured wine into the silver cup. Jesus surrounded himself with the marginalized and the outcast. He challenged religious authorities. He spoke of liberation and equality in ways that would be considered radical even today. She set down the decanter and picked up the cup, staring into the dark red liquid. The church as it exists now, as my husband and Reverend Caldwell practice it, bears little resemblance to the faith described in these texts. It has become a tool to maintain power, to justify oppression. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a fitting backdrop to Elizabeth's declaration. She looked up at Esther, her eyes clear and determined. I've made a decision, Esther. I can no longer participate in a faith that has been so distorted. Today, I am reclaiming baptism, not as a ritual controlled by men who pick and choose which parts of Scripture to follow, but as the radical act of equality it was meant to be. With those words, Elizabeth stepped toward the rushing water, the silver cup held before her like an offering. "What are you doing?" Esther asked, alarm overriding her usual reserve. "I'm going to baptize myself," Elizabeth replied. "And then, if you're willing, I want to baptize you, not as my slave, but as my sister in humanity." The words hung in the air between them, as shocking as if Elizabeth had slapped her. Esther had heard of abolitionists in the North who spoke of equality and brotherhood, but never from a Southern slaveholder, and certainly never from the wife of one of the county's largest plantation owners. "Miss Elizabeth, please," Esther said urgently. "This is dangerous talk. If anyone heard, let them hear." Elizabeth's voice had taken on a fervent quality that frightened Esther more than her words. "I'm tired of living a lie, of pretending that the suffering of others doesn't matter as long as my own comfort is secured." She took another step toward the water, her skirts already brushing against the muddy bank. "Will you join me, Esther? Not as my servant, but as a fellow human being seeking truth." Esther stood frozen, torn between fear and something else, a dangerous glimmer of hope. Could Elizabeth truly have undergone such a transformation? Or was this some kind of test, a trap to expose sympathies that could get her sold or worse? "This isn't wise," she finally said. "The river is too high, the current too strong. And if anyone saw us, no one will see us. Thomas is in town, the overseer is at the far fields, and everyone else is occupied with their daily tasks." Elizabeth held out her hand. "Please, I need to do this, and I need a witness who understands why it matters." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and peril. Esther looked at Elizabeth's outstretched hand, the same hand that had slapped her once when they were children, the same hand that signed the documents transferring ownership of human beings, the same hand that now offered what? Friendship, equality, redemption. Before Esther could decide, a voice called from the path behind them. "Miss Elizabeth, are you out here?" It was Mercy, her young face anxious as she emerged from the willows. She stopped short at the scene before her, Elizabeth standing at the water's edge with communion items, Esther looking stricken. "What is it, Mercy?" Esther asked, relief and frustration mingling in her voice. "Riders coming up the drive," Mercy reported. "Mr. Miller sent me to find you. He says it's important, something about Reverend Caldwell bringing men from town." Elizabeth's face paled. "Reverend Caldwell? With men? How many? What kind of men?" "I don't know, ma'am. Just that there's several of them, and Mr. Miller says they look serious." Elizabeth and Esther exchanged glances, mutual understanding passing between them. Whatever Elizabeth had planned at the river would have to wait. Something more urgent demanded their attention. "Help me pack these things," Elizabeth instructed, already gathering the communion items. "Quickly!" As they hurried to conceal the evidence of Elizabeth's intended sacrilege, the distant thunder grew louder. The storm was approaching, both literally and figuratively. By the time they reached the main house, a group of riders had already dismounted in the front yard. Reverend Caldwell stood on the porch with Jacob Miller, deep in conversation. Beside them were 4 men Elizabeth recognized from town: a shopkeeper, the blacksmith, a lawyer, and the editor of the county newspaper. All looked grim. "Mrs. Montgomery," Reverend Caldwell called as he spotted her approaching from the path. "We've been looking for you." Elizabeth squared her shoulders, handing her bag discreetly to Esther. "As you can see, Reverend, I've been walking on my property. Is that now a matter of public concern?" Her tone was haughty, the plantation mistress reasserting herself after the vulnerability she had shown at the riverside. Esther marveled at the transformation, wondering which was the true Elizabeth, the radical who spoke of equality by the river, or this cold aristocrat facing down unwelcome visitors. "Under normal circumstances, no," the Reverend replied. "But these are not normal circumstances. May we speak privately?" "You may speak to me here," Elizabeth countered. "I have nothing to hide from my household." The Reverend's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Very well. It has come to my attention that you've been engaging in unorthodox religious activities that border on blasphemy." Elizabeth's expression remained impassive, though Esther, standing slightly behind her, noticed her hands trembling slightly. "What specific activities are you referring to, Reverend?" Last Sunday you were observed conducting what appeared to be a communion service for a group of slaves in the woods beyond your north pasture. You used consecrated elements stolen from the church and administered them without authority. A murmur ran through the small crowd that had gathered, house slaves pausing in their duties, stable boys lingering at the edges of the yard, all watching the confrontation with wary eyes. Elizabeth's laugh was brittle. Is that what brings a delegation of the town's finest to my doorstep? The suspicion that I shared bread and wine with people you consider unworthy of such sacraments. It's more than that, Mrs. Montgomery, the lawyer, Mr. Hargrove, interjected. There are whispers that you've been spreading dangerous ideas among the slaves, not just religious notions, but abolitionist sentiments. In the current climate, such actions could incite unrest, even violence. Whispers, Elizabeth repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. And who is doing this whispering, Mr. Hargrove? Disgruntled former employees, jealous neighbors, or perhaps those who fear any challenge to their comfortable assumptions about divine approval for the institution of slavery? The men shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. The Reverend stepped forward, his voice lowered. Elizabeth, please. Consider what you're saying and where. This doesn't need to become a public scandal. We're here as friends of your husband, concerned for your welfare and the reputation of your family. My husband. Elizabeth's smile was chilling. Yes, I imagine Thomas would be distressed to find his property, both human and otherwise, being influenced by my dangerous ideas. How fortunate that he's not here to witness this inquisition. The newspaper editor, a thin man with spectacles, cleared his throat. Speaking of Mr. Montgomery, we encountered him on the road as we were coming here. He should be arriving shortly. Elizabeth's composure faltered for the first time. She glanced at Esther, a flicker of panic in her eyes before she regained control. Then I suggest we adjourn to the parlor to await his return. Gentlemen. She gestured toward the house, every inch the gracious hostess, despite the confrontational nature of their visit. As the men filed past her onto the porch, Reverend Caldwell paused. I'm truly sorry it's come to this, Elizabeth. I had hoped our conversations might guide you back to a more orthodox understanding of faith and duty, and I had hoped you might recognize the hypocrisy of a gospel that preaches freedom while endorsing bondage. She replied quietly, for his ears only. We are both disappointed, it seems. Inside the house, an uncomfortable silence descended on the parlor as Elizabeth and her unwanted guests waited for Thomas's return. Samuel served coffee, his face a careful mask, as he moved among the men who were discussing his fate and the fate of everyone like him, as if they weren't human enough to comprehend the conversation. Mercy had been dismissed to the kitchen, but Esther remained in the room, standing behind Elizabeth's chair, both as her personal servant and, though none of the men recognized it, as her ally in whatever was about to unfold. The communion items from the river were safely hidden in Esther's cabin, but both women knew that physical evidence was the least of their concerns now. The sound of hooves on gravel announced Thomas's arrival. Moments later, he burst into the parlor, his face flushed with anger and exertion. What the hell is going on? He demanded, looking from the Reverend to his wife. I'm stopped on the road by Jenkins telling me there's a delegation heading to my home to confront my wife about some kind of religious scandal. Thomas, Elizabeth began, rising from her chair. Not now, Elizabeth. He cut her off with a sharp gesture. Reverend, explain yourself. What gives you the right to come onto my property and accuse my wife of whatever this is about? Reverend Caldwell stood, meeting Thomas's glare with calm authority. I apologize for the manner of our arrival, Thomas, but the situation is serious. Several witnesses have come forward with accounts of Elizabeth conducting unauthorized religious ceremonies with slaves, distributing literature containing abolitionist sentiments, and expressing views that directly challenge the scriptural basis for our way of life. Thomas's gaze swung to Elizabeth, disbelief etched on his features. Is this true? Elizabeth lifted her chin. If by unauthorized religious ceremonies they mean sharing the gospel as Christ instructed his followers to do, then yes. If by abolitionist sentiments they mean questioning whether ownership of human beings is compatible with Christian teachings on love and justice, then yes to that as well. The color drained from Thomas's face. Have you lost your mind? Do you have any idea what you're saying? What the implications could be for this family, for this plantation? I know exactly what I'm saying, Thomas. Elizabeth's voice was steady now, all hesitation gone. I've had months to consider it, ever since William died, and I began to question everything I thought I knew about God's will. This isn't about William, Thomas hissed, stepping closer to her. This is about you indulging in dangerous fantasies without regard for consequences. On the contrary, Elizabeth replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. It's about finally recognizing that there are consequences far beyond our comfort and convenience, moral consequences that we've all been ignoring for too long. The tension in the room was palpable. The visitors watched the marital confrontation with a mixture of discomfort and morbid fascination. Only Esther seemed to notice the subtle shift in the quality of light through the windows, the approaching storm darkening the sky to a premature twilight. "Mrs. Montgomery," Mr. Hargrove intervened, "perhaps you don't fully understand the legal ramifications of what you've been doing. Inciting slave unrest is a serious offense in Georgia. People have been imprisoned for less than what you're alleged to have done." "I'm aware of the law, Mr. Hargrove," Elizabeth replied coolly. "I'm also aware of a higher law that doesn't recognize property rights in human flesh." A shocked silence followed her words. Even Thomas seemed stunned by her open defiance. In the quiet, they all heard it, the rumble of thunder directly overhead, followed by the sudden drumming of rain on the roof. The storm had arrived. As if the weather had broken some spell, Thomas turned to the other men. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern, but this is a private family matter now. I'll handle it accordingly." The Reverend hesitated. "Thomas, the church elders will expect some resolution. There are questions of religious authority, of doctrinal integrity, which I will address," Thomas interrupted firmly. "My wife has obviously been emotionally fragile since our son's death. She needs rest and guidance, not public scrutiny." The men exchanged glances, clearly reluctant to leave, but unwilling to challenge Thomas's authority in his own home. One by one, they nodded their agreement. "Very well," Reverend Caldwell conceded. "But this matter can't simply be ignored, Thomas. There are principles at stake that affect our entire community." "I understand," Thomas replied grimly. "And I assure you, appropriate measures will be taken." As the visitors prepared to leave, bracing themselves for the downpour outside, Elizabeth suddenly spoke. "Reverend, before you go, I have a question." All eyes turned to her. "When you baptize a person, what exactly are you baptizing? Their soul, their mind, or their social status?" The Reverend frowned. "The sacrament of baptism is a washing away of sin and a rebirth in Christ, Mrs. Montgomery. You know this." "Yes, but who decides who is worthy of this rebirth? Who determines which souls may be washed clean and which must remain stained?" Elizabeth's voice had taken on that fervent quality again, her eyes bright with conviction, or perhaps something closer to madness. "If Christ died for all, as Scripture tells us, then by what authority do you or any man restrict his grace?" "Elizabeth, enough." Thomas's voice cracked like a whip, but she wasn't finished. "Tell me, Reverend, if I baptized a slave, not as a slave, but as a child of God, equal in his sight to any white person, would that baptism be valid? Or does God's power depend on human approval?" The question hung in the air, electrifying as the lightning that flashed outside the windows. No one spoke. No one moved. In that frozen moment, Esther felt something shift, not just in the room, but in the very fabric of Twin Oaks plantation. Whatever happened next, nothing would be the same. The Reverend finally broke the silence, his voice heavy with disappointment and something like fear. "May God have mercy on your soul, Elizabeth Montgomery. You're treading a dangerous path." "Perhaps," Elizabeth replied softly. "Or perhaps I'm finally walking the path Christ intended all along." As the men filed out into the storm, Thomas remained in the parlor, staring at his wife as if seeing a stranger. Outside, thunder crashed and lightning illuminated the world in stark flashes, nature itself seeming to respond to the human drama unfolding at Twin Oaks. The storm had only begun. The rain continued through the night, a relentless downpour that turned Twin Oaks' manicured grounds to mud and the surrounding fields to swamps. By morning, the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the plantation had overflowed its banks, making the road to town impassable. The isolation suited Thomas Montgomery's purposes perfectly. No visitors meant no witnesses to what was about to occur. In the study, Thomas paced before the fireplace, a glass of bourbon in his hand despite the early hour. Elizabeth sat rigidly in a chair across from him, her face pale but composed. They had been locked in this standoff since dawn, their voices occasionally rising loud enough that the house slaves paused in their work, straining to hear fragments of the confrontation. "You've left me no choice," Thomas said, setting down his empty glass with a sharp click against the mahogany desk. "Your behavior has become not just embarrassing, but dangerous. You will leave for my sister's home in Charleston this afternoon." "I will not," Elizabeth replied evenly. Thomas's face darkened. "This isn't a request, Elizabeth. You're my wife, and you will do as I say. Charlotte's house is large, her social circle respectable. You'll have the best medical care, the finest amenities." "Medical care?" Elizabeth interrupted, her eyebrows rising. "You make it sound as though I'm ill." "Aren't you?" Thomas stopped his pacing to look directly at her. "What else would you call this? This moral confusion, these delusions about equality, this religious mania?" "I call it clarity, Thomas. For the first time in my life, I'm seeing things as they truly are." She leaned forward slightly, her voice earnest. "Don't you ever wonder if there's something wrong with a society that measures a man's worth by how many human beings he owns? Don't you ever question what it does to the soul to treat people as property?" Thomas slammed his fist against the desk. "Enough! I've listened to this nonsense for hours. You've been corrupted by those pamphlets you think I don't know about, northern abolitionists filling your head with their sanctimonious drivel. Well, it ends today. You'll go to Charleston willingly, or you'll be committed to the asylum at Milledgeville. Your choice." The threat hung in the air between them. Milledgeville's state asylum was notorious, a place where inconvenient wives could be locked away indefinitely, diagnosed with female hysteria or religious melancholia, or any number of vague conditions that justified their confinement. "You wouldn't dare," Elizabeth whispered, though the fear in her eyes suggested she knew he would. "Try me." Thomas's voice was cold. "One word from me and Doctor. Reynolds will sign the necessary papers. He's already expressed concern about your mental state since William's death." Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, composing herself. When she opened them again, there was a new calculation in her gaze. "Very well, I'll go to Charleston, but I have conditions. You're hardly in a position to negotiate." "Nevertheless," she straightened her spine. "First, I want to take Esther and Mercy with me." Thomas scoffed. "Impossible. Esther runs the household here, and the girl is being trained to replace Ida eventually." "Then I'll go to Milledgeville," Elizabeth stated flatly. "And I'll tell anyone who will listen about the religious services I've been conducting with the slaves, about the literature I've been sharing, about my husband who would rather commit his wife to an asylum than confront his own moral failings." They stared at each other, locked in a battle of wills. Finally, Thomas looked away. "Fine. You may take Esther. The girl stays." Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. "Second condition, I want my mother's jewelry and my personal inheritance from my father." Not the portion that was transferred to you upon our marriage, but the trust that remains in my name." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "Why? Charlotte can provide anything you need." "Consider it insurance," Elizabeth replied, "against the possibility that your sister's welcome might wear thin, or that you might decide the asylum is still the better option despite our agreement." After a long moment, Thomas nodded grudgingly. "Anything else?" "Yes." Elizabeth stood, smoothing her skirts with steady hands. "I want to address the house slaves before I go, to explain my departure and give instructions regarding my personal belongings." "Absolutely not. You'll say your goodbyes to Samuel, and that's all. The rest will be informed after you've gone." Elizabeth looked as though she might argue further, but something in Thomas's expression made her reconsider. "Very well. When do we leave?" "As soon as the road is passable. Miller will check it this afternoon." Thomas walked to the study door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "This is for your own good, Elizabeth. You'll see that once you're away from here, once you've had proper rest and guidance. Perhaps," she conceded, though her tone suggested otherwise, "or perhaps distance will only clarify what I already know to be true." Thomas left without responding, closing the door firmly behind him. As his footsteps receded down the hallway, Elizabeth sank back into her chair, the composed facade crumbling. She pressed her hands to her face, shoulders shaking with silent sobs, not of defeat, but of desperate frustration. She had miscalculated badly. Her confrontation with Reverend Caldwell and the town delegation had come too soon, before her plans were fully in place. Now she was to be exiled, separated from the people she had promised to help, her nascent mission crushed before it could truly begin. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She quickly wiped her eyes and called, "Enter." Samuel appeared, his aged face grave. "Miss Elizabeth, the master asks that you begin packing immediately. He's instructed me to send Esther to assist you." Elizabeth nodded, studying the old butler's face for any hint of his thoughts. "Thank you, Samuel. Have you been told where I'm going?" "To Charleston, ma'am, to stay with Miss Charlotte." His eyes met hers briefly. "And Esther is to accompany you." There was a question in his voice, subtle, deniable if challenged, but unmistakable to Elizabeth's ears. She stood and moved closer to him, lowering her voice. "Samuel, there's something I need you to do for me, something important." His expression didn't change, but wariness entered his eyes. "Yes, Miss Elizabeth. In my dressing room, behind the false panel in the armoire, there's a small leather-bound book, not my Bible, but a journal. I need you to take it and—" She hesitated, then continued, "Find a way to give it to Mercy. Tell her to keep it safe until Esther returns." Samuel's gaze sharpened. "Until Esther returns, ma'am? Not until you both return?" Elizabeth held his eyes steadily. "Just do as I ask, Samuel, please." After a long moment he nodded. "Yes, Miss Elizabeth." "And Samuel." She touched his arm lightly, an unprecedented gesture that made him stiffen slightly. "Thank you for everything." He bowed slightly, his face once again an unreadable mask, and left to carry out her instructions. Alone again, Elizabeth moved to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked landscape of Twin Oaks, the plantation that had been her home for 15 years, the place where she had given birth to her children, buried her youngest son, and finally awakened to the moral abomination that underpinned her comfortable existence. She would go to Charleston as Thomas demanded. But this wasn't the end of her journey. It was merely a detour. In the kitchen, Mercy was helping Ida prepare the midday meal, though the atmosphere was subdued. Word of Elizabeth's impending departure had spread through the house slaves' whispered network, along with rumors about why she was being sent away. "They say she was holding church services for field hands," Ida murmured, kneading dough with arthritic fingers, out in the woods, reading scripture and serving communion like she was some kind of preacher. Mercy said nothing, concentrating on peeling potatoes. She had seen enough at the riverbank yesterday to know that something strange was happening with Miss Elizabeth, but her mother had warned her to keep silent about what she had witnessed. "Your mamma's going with her," Ida continued, glancing at Mercy. "To Charleston. Could be a long time before you see her again." Mercy's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their work. "She'll come back," she said with quiet certainty. Ida shook her head. "Don't count on it, child. Once they send them away, they don't often come back, especially not if they've been causing the kind of trouble Miss Elizabeth has." "What kind of trouble?" Mercy asked, unable to contain her curiosity despite her mother's warnings. Ida leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. They say she was teaching slaves to read the Bible for themselves, that she told them Jesus meant for all people to be free, not just white folks. That's dangerous talk, girl. The kind that gets people killed." Before Mercy could respond, the kitchen door swung open and Samuel entered. His expression was grim as he approached Mercy. "Girl, come with me. I need help bringing down Miss Elizabeth's trunks from the attic." Ida nodded permission, and Mercy set aside her work to follow Samuel. Once they were in the hallway, out of Ida's hearing, the old butler's demeanor changed. "Your mother will be leaving with Miss Elizabeth today or tomorrow," he said quietly as they climbed the back stairs. "There's something I need to give you first." Mercy's heart raced. "What is it?" "Not here." Samuel glanced around, ensuring they were alone. "Meet me by the smokehouse after dinner. Don't tell anyone." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity as the household prepared for Elizabeth's departure. Trunks were packed, arrangements made, instructions given regarding which of her personal items would go to Charleston and which would remain at Twin Oaks. Through it all, Elizabeth maintained a calm exterior that belied her inner turmoil. Esther worked efficiently, packing her mistress's belongings while simultaneously preparing her own meager possessions for the journey. Unlike Elizabeth, she had no trunks, only a small bundle containing an extra dress, a threadbare shawl, and a few personal items she had managed to acquire over the years. "You don't have to come," Elizabeth said quietly, as they worked in her bedchamber, the door closed for privacy. "I know what I'm asking of you, to leave your daughter, your home, everything familiar." Esther folded a silk nightgown and placed it carefully in the trunk. "Do I truly have a choice, Miss Elizabeth?" "You always have a choice," Elizabeth replied, "even when others try to deny it to you." Their eyes met in understanding. Esther had her own reasons for agreeing to go to Charleston, reasons that had nothing to do with Elizabeth's plans or Thomas's demands. "The Underground Railroad has connections in Charleston," Esther said softly, naming explicitly what had only been hinted at before. "If we can reach them." Elizabeth nodded. "We will. I promise you that." Late in the afternoon, Jacob Miller returned from checking the road with news that the creek had receded enough to allow passage. Thomas immediately ordered the carriage prepared for departure first thing the following morning. Elizabeth would spend one more night at Twin Oaks before beginning her exile. As twilight descended, Mercy slipped away from the kitchen as instructed, making her way to the smokehouse behind the main house. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and a thick mist rose from the sodden ground, cloaking her movements from casual observation. Samuel was already waiting, a dark shape against the weathered wood of the building. He pressed something into her hands, a small book wrapped in oilcloth. "From Miss Elizabeth," he whispered. "For your mother. Keep it hidden until she returns." Mercy clutched the package to her chest. "When will that be?" Samuel's face was shadowed, unreadable in the gathering darkness. "That depends on many things, child. But your mother is strong and clever. She'll find her way back to you." "What's happening, Samuel?" Mercy's voice trembled slightly. "Why is Miss Elizabeth being sent away? What did she do?" The old butler was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of observed suffering. She started to see Mercy, started to question things most white folks take as natural as breathing. And that kind of seeing is dangerous in a place like this. Dangerous for who? For everyone. Samuel glanced toward the main house. "Now go before you're missed. And remember, tell no one about the book." Mercy nodded and hurried away, the package concealed beneath her apron. As she reached the back door to the kitchen, she nearly collided with Isaac, the stable boy who had overheard Thomas's conversation with Miller days earlier. "Careful," he warned, steadying her with a hand on her arm. "Folks are watching everyone extra close today." "What do you mean?" Isaac glanced around before answering. "Master's got Miller and the other overseers keeping an eye on the house slaves. Thinks Miss Elizabeth might have turned some of you against him." "That's ridiculous," Mercy said, though her hand instinctively pressed against the hidden package. "Is it?" Isaac's voice was bitter. "They know something was happening. They just don't know what or who was involved." He lowered his voice further. "There's talk in the quarters. Some say Miss Elizabeth was planning something big, something that would have helped people escape." Mercy's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her face neutral. "That's just talk. You shouldn't listen to it, and you definitely shouldn't repeat it." Isaac studied her face. "Your mama's going with her tomorrow." "By the master's order," Mercy replied carefully. "Sure." Isaac clearly didn't believe that was the whole story. "Just watch yourself, Mercy. Things are changing around here, and not for the better." Inside the main house, dinner was a tense affair. Thomas and Elizabeth sat at opposite ends of the dining table, barely speaking, except to request that dishes be passed. The usual household rhythm continued around them, Samuel serving, Esther supervising, other house slaves moving efficiently through their evening duties. But an undercurrent of tension permeated every interaction. After dinner, Thomas retreated to his study with a decanter of bourbon, while Elizabeth remained in the dining room, staring out the window at the misty darkness beyond the glass. "Would you like me to prepare your evening tea, Miss Elizabeth?" Esther asked softly. Elizabeth turned from the window, her expression distant. "Yes, thank you. I'll take it in my room." "And Esther?" She hesitated, then added, "Make enough for yourself as well. We have things to discuss before tomorrow." In Elizabeth's bedroom, with the door locked against interruption, the two women sat facing each other, Elizabeth in her dressing gown on the edge of the bed, Esther perched uncomfortably on a small chair nearby. Between them, on a small table, sat the tea service, steam rising from two delicate porcelain cups. "You should know the full extent of what you're getting into," Elizabeth said, cradling her cup. "Charleston isn't just a temporary exile for me. It's the next step in what I've been planning for months." Esther sipped her tea cautiously. "And what is that exactly?" "Liberation." Elizabeth's eyes glowed with conviction, not just spiritual but physical. "I've been in contact with abolitionists in Philadelphia. They've provided literature, contacts, funds. My plan was to establish a stop on the Underground Railroad here at Twin Oaks." Esther nearly choked on her tea. "Here, under the master's nose?" "It would have been the perfect cover," Elizabeth replied. "Who would suspect the mistress of one of the largest plantations in the county? I could have moved dozens of people to freedom over time." "That's insane," Esther said bluntly, momentarily forgetting the careful deference expected of her. "You would have been caught eventually. And then what? Everyone involved would have suffered." Elizabeth set down her cup. "Perhaps. But isn't that a risk worth taking for freedom? Isn't that what you've been doing with your midnight journeys to the Marshall property?" Esther froze. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Elizabeth leaned forward. "David Marshall's eldest son is a station master for the Underground Railroad. You've been acting as a conductor, guiding people from neighboring plantations to their property where they can connect with the next stop on the route north." The revelation hung in the air between them. Esther's hands trembled slightly as she set down her own teacup. "How long have you known?" "Months," Elizabeth admitted. "I saw you returning one night and followed you the next time you went out. I watched from a distance as you led a woman and her child to the marshal's barn." Esther's mind raced. If Elizabeth had known all this time and said nothing, it meant she had been protecting Esther's secret, but it also meant she held devastating power over her. "Why didn't you expose me?" she asked finally. "Because I admired your courage," Elizabeth answered simply, "and because I was beginning to question everything I'd been taught about the morality of slavery. Watching you risk everything to help others find freedom, it forced me to confront my own complicity in a system I was starting to recognize as evil. Esther studied Elizabeth's face, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. Finding none, she took a deep breath. So what happens now? You've been caught before your plan could begin, and we're being sent to Charleston, which is actually fortunate, Elizabeth countered. Charleston has one of the busiest ports in the South and a robust network of the Underground Railroad operating in secret. My sister-in-law Charlotte is a widow who spends most of her time in social pursuits. Her household will be much easier to navigate than this one, with fewer eyes watching our every move. You still intend to pursue this madness? Esther couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. I do. Elizabeth reached across the space between them, an unprecedented gesture that made Esther flinch slightly. And I need your help, Esther, not as my slave, but as my ally, my sister in this fight. The words echoed their exchange by the river, but this time the context was clear. Elizabeth wasn't speaking of symbolic equality through baptism, but of a concrete partnership in dangerous, illegal activity. And if I refuse? Esther asked quietly. Then I'll continue alone, Elizabeth replied without hesitation, and find a way to ensure you can return to Twin Oaks, to Mercy. I won't force you to join me in this. Esther was silent for a long moment, weighing her options. The opportunity Elizabeth presented was both tantalizing and terrifying, a chance to work with resources and connections she could never access on her own, but at a level of risk that made her previous activities seem like child's play. I need to think, she finally said. Elizabeth nodded. Of course, but we leave at dawn, so don't think too long. As Esther gathered the tea service to return it to the kitchen, Elizabeth added, Whatever you decide, I've left something for Mercy. Samuel will make sure she receives it. Esther paused at the door. What is it? My journal. It contains everything, my thoughts, my contacts, the beginnings of my plan. If something happens to us in Charleston, if we're separated or worse, that journal could help others continue what we've started. Elizabeth's gaze was steady. I trust your daughter to keep it safe until it's needed. The implications of this trust weren't lost on Esther. By involving Mercy, even peripherally, Elizabeth was binding their fates together in ways that transcended the master-slave relationship. It was both a gesture of faith and a form of insurance. Esther would be less likely to betray Elizabeth if her own daughter was implicated in the conspiracy. I'll see you in the morning, Miss Elizabeth, Esther said neutrally, giving no indication of her decision. As she closed the bedroom door behind her, Esther felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The choice before her wasn't just about her own freedom or safety, but about Mercy's future, about the countless others who might be helped or harmed by her decision. In the darkened hallway, she paused, remembering her grandmother's words from long ago. Freedom ain't just about chains, child. It's about choosing your own path, even when every path looks dangerous. Dawn broke grey and misty over Twin Oaks Plantation. The household was already active, final preparations being made for Elizabeth and Esther's departure. In the stable yard, Thomas supervised the loading of trunks onto the carriage, while Jacob Miller prepared to ride alongside as escort for the first part of the journey. Inside, Elizabeth moved through the house one last time, her face composed, but her eyes taking in every detail as if committing the place to memory. She wore a plain traveling dress of dark blue, her hair neatly arranged beneath a matching bonnet. Anyone observing her would see only a proper Southern lady preparing for a journey, not a woman on the verge of rebellion. In the kitchen, Mercy and Esther shared a brief, intense farewell, conscious of Ida's watchful presence nearby. "Be strong," Esther whispered, embracing her daughter. "Remember everything I've taught you." Mercy nodded, fighting back tears. "I will, Mama, and I'll keep it safe, just like Samuel said." Esther pulled back slightly, studying her daughter's face. "What do you mean?" "The book," Mercy whispered so softly that even Ida, working just feet away, couldn't hear. "Miss Elizabeth's journal. Samuel gave it to me last night. Alarm flashed across Esther's features, quickly suppressed. Good. Hide it well. Tell no one. Their goodbye was cut short by Samuel's appearance at the kitchen door. It's time, Esther. The master is waiting. With a final embrace, Esther released her daughter and collected her small bundle of possessions. As she followed Samuel through the house, her mind was made up. Elizabeth's radical plan, her dangerous alliance, her offer of partnership, Esther had decided to accept it all. Not for Elizabeth's sake, not for some abstract ideal of justice or equality, but for mercy, for the chance that her daughter might someday live as a free woman in a world where her humanity wasn't defined by the color of her skin or the status of her birth. At the front door, Elizabeth was saying her goodbyes to the assembled house slaves, her manner gracious but reserved. Thomas watched impatiently from the porch, clearly anxious to have this business concluded. "Come, Elizabeth," he called. "We're losing daylight." With a final nod to Samuel, Elizabeth stepped out onto the porch. Esther followed, her eyes briefly meeting those of Isaac, who stood near the carriage holding the door open. Something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding. Thomas helped Elizabeth into the carriage, then turned to Esther. "Sit up front with the driver," he instructed curtly. Esther complied without comment, climbing onto the high seat beside Moses, an elderly slave who had served as the Montgomerys' coachman for decades. From this elevated position, she had a clear view of the entire plantation, the main house with its white columns, the slave quarters in the distance, the fields stretching to the horizon, and the river where Elizabeth had attempted her blasphemous baptism just days before. Thomas approached the carriage one last time, speaking through the window to Elizabeth. "Charlotte will write when you've arrived safely. Remember our agreement. You're there to rest and recover. No more of this religious mania, no more dangerous ideas." "Of course, Thomas," Elizabeth replied, her voice honey-sweet. "I understand perfectly." Something in her tone made him frown, but he stepped back and signaled to Moses, "You may proceed. Godspeed." The carriage lurched forward, wheels crunching on the gravel drive. As they passed beneath the ancient oaks that gave the plantation its name, Esther glanced back one last time. Mercy stood on the porch among the other house slaves, a small, solitary figure with her hand raised in farewell. Esther turned to face forward toward Charleston, toward uncertainty, toward the possibility of freedom. Beside her, Moses handled the reins with practiced skill, his weathered face impassive. Behind her, inside the carriage, Elizabeth Montgomery sat alone, a woman who had rejected everything she had been raised to believe for a cause that might well destroy her. The sun broke through the morning mist, illuminating the road ahead, a road that led away from Twin Oaks, but perhaps, just perhaps, towards something better. As the plantation receded behind them, neither woman knew that forces had already been set in motion that would make their return impossible. That Twin Oaks itself was about to become the site of events that would reverberate throughout the county and beyond. The journey to Charleston had begun. But the true journey, the one that would test both women's courage, conviction, and capacity for sacrifice, was only just beginning. The journey to Charleston took 3 days, lengthened by rain-swollen rivers and muddy roads that slowed their progress. By the time the carriage rolled through the elegant streets of the port city, both women were exhausted, their bodies aching from the constant jostling over rutted roads, their minds weary from the strain of maintaining their respective facades. Elizabeth as the proper plantation mistress traveling to visit family, Esther as the dutiful slave attending her mistress. Charlotte Montgomery Pinckney's home on Trad Street embodied Charleston aristocracy, a 3-story brick mansion with wrought-iron balconies and a garden enclosed by a high brick wall. As the carriage stopped before the imposing front door, Elizabeth straightened her travel-rumpled dress and adjusted her bonnet, preparing to face her sister-in-law. Remember, she murmured to Esther as they waited for Moses to open the carriage door. "Charlotte knows nothing of my true purpose here. As far as she's concerned, I'm merely recovering from grief and nervous exhaustion." Esther nodded slightly, her face carefully blank. Throughout the journey, they had spoken little of their plans, conscious of Moses's presence and the occasional stops at inns and way stations where other ears might overhear. But in the brief moments of privacy they had managed, Elizabeth had outlined what she knew of Charleston's abolitionist network and the contacts they would need to establish. The front door of the mansion swung open, and Charlotte Pinckney emerged, a tall, willowy woman in her 40s, her blonde hair showing the first threads of silver, her bearing regal despite the genuine warmth in her smile. "Elizabeth, at last!" She descended the steps gracefully, arms outstretched. "We were beginning to worry. Thomas's letter said you would arrive yesterday." Elizabeth accepted her sister-in-law's embrace with practiced ease. The roads were worse than expected, especially near the Santee River crossing. "I'm sorry to have caused you concern." "Nonsense. You're here now, and that's what matters." Charlotte's gaze shifted to Esther, her expression cooling slightly. "And this is your maid?" "Yes, this is Esther. She's been with me since childhood." Elizabeth's tone was deliberately casual, as if Esther were merely a familiar piece of furniture brought along for comfort. Charlotte nodded dismissively before turning back to Elizabeth. "You must be exhausted. Come inside. I've had the blue room prepared for you. It has the loveliest view of the garden. We can talk properly once you've rested." As they entered the house, Elizabeth was acutely aware of the shift in atmosphere, from the rural isolation of Twin Oaks to the sophisticated urban environment of Charleston. Charlotte's home hummed with activity. Slaves moved efficiently through the hallways, attending to the needs of the household with the practiced precision of a well-oiled machine. The furnishings were more ornate, the artwork more abundant, the very air scented with exotic spices from the kitchen and fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases. A middle-aged black woman in a crisp uniform approached, her posture perfect, her expression carefully neutral. "Welcome to Pinckney House, Mrs. Montgomery. I am Agnes, the housekeeper. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your room." As they climbed the sweeping staircase to the second floor, Elizabeth noted the subtle hierarchies among Charlotte's slaves. The house servants clearly held themselves above the kitchen staff, and all of them regarded Esther with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The outsider, the country slave, not yet assigned a place in their established order. The blue room lived up to its name, decorated in shades of azure and periwinkle, with large windows overlooking a garden lush with camellias and magnolias. Agnes efficiently directed the placement of Elizabeth's trunks and explained the household schedule. Breakfast at 8, dinner at 2, supper at 7. "Mrs. Pinckney usually takes tea in the garden at 4, weather permitting," she added. "She hopes you'll join her today if you're not too tired from your journey." "Please tell her I look forward to it," Elizabeth replied, slipping easily into the rhythm of such formal interactions. Once Agnes had departed, closing the door behind her, Elizabeth sank onto the edge of the bed, the facade of composed gentility dropping away to reveal her exhaustion. "Well," she said softly to Esther, who stood waiting for instructions, "we've arrived. Now the real work begins." Esther moved to unpack Elizabeth's trunks, her voice low. "This house has more eyes and ears than Twin Oaks. We'll need to be even more careful here. Yes, but it also has more coming and going, more visitors, more connections to the outside world." Elizabeth glanced toward the window, where the busy Charleston harbor was visible in the distance. Opportunity amidst the challenges. As Esther hung dresses in the wardrobe, she asked, "How soon do you plan to make contact?" "Not immediately," Elizabeth replied. "First, I need to establish myself here, understand Charlotte's household and her social circle. The last thing we need is unwanted attention before we've even begun." She paused, adding, "Besides, I suspect Charlotte has been instructed to monitor my behavior closely. Thomas wouldn't have sent me here without ensuring his sister would report any concerning activities. Esther nodded, understanding the strategy. Patience had always been essential to survival for her people, the ability to wait for the right moment, to endure until an opportunity presented itself. It was a skill Elizabeth was only beginning to learn. That afternoon, tea in the garden provided Elizabeth with her first insights into Charlotte's world. The widow Pinckney was clearly a social force in Charleston, her conversation peppered with references to prominent families, political discussions, and charitable endeavors. She was also, Elizabeth quickly discerned, deeply conventional in her views. "I must say, Thomas's letter quite alarmed me," Charlotte commented as she poured tea into delicate porcelain cups. "He mentioned you've been experiencing some unusual ideas since your bereavement." Elizabeth added a precise amount of sugar to her tea, buying time to formulate her response. "Grief affects people in different ways, Charlotte. I found myself questioning many things I had previously accepted without thought." Questioning is natural," Charlotte conceded, "but Thomas suggested your questions had taken a rather radical turn, particularly regarding the relationship between master and slave." The directness of the statement confirmed Elizabeth's suspicion that her sister-in-law had been thoroughly briefed on the situation. She sipped her tea before responding, her voice deliberately thoughtful. "I expressed some concerns about the spiritual welfare of our people," she said carefully, "perhaps with more zeal than wisdom. Reverend Caldwell misinterpreted my interest in their religious instruction as something more political." Charlotte seemed to relax slightly. "Ah, I see. Religious enthusiasm is so easily misunderstood, especially in these tense times. Just last month, Reverend Hammond at St. Michael's had to publicly censure a parishioner for distributing Bibles among her household slaves without proper supervision." "Indeed. What was the objection?" Elizabeth kept her tone merely curious. The particular translation she chose contained passages that could be misinterpreted by those without the education to understand their proper context. Charlotte's delicate emphasis on education made her meaning clear. Slaves reading scripture for themselves might find inconvenient messages about freedom and equality. "How concerning," Elizabeth murmured, internally noting that Bible distribution was clearly monitored in Charleston. Another complication to consider. Yes, quite. Especially with all this troubling abolitionist activity in the North. Charlotte leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice despite the fact that they were alone in the garden. "Did you know there have been pamphlets found right here in Charleston? Dreadful, inflammatory things smuggled in on merchant ships. The mayor has increased patrols at the harbour, and several northern ships have been turned away on suspicion of carrying such materials." This was valuable information, and Elizabeth filed it away while maintaining an appropriately shocked expression. How terrible. One wonders what these abolitionists hope to accomplish beyond creating unrest. Precisely. Charlotte sat back, pleased by Elizabeth's apparent agreement. They have no understanding of our way of life, of the special relationship between master and slave in the South. Their meddling only makes conditions worse for everyone. The conversation continued in this vein, with Charlotte providing unwitting intelligence about Charleston's defenses against abolitionist influence, while Elizabeth played the role of the chastened zealot, now seeing the error of her ways. By the time they rose to prepare for dinner, Charlotte seemed thoroughly convinced that Thomas had overreacted to Elizabeth's temporary lapse in judgment. "I'm so relieved to find you so sensible, my dear," she said, patting Elizabeth's hand affectionately. "I confess I was concerned when Thomas wrote of sending you to Dr. Percival for treatment." Elizabeth tensed slightly. "Dr. Percival?" "Yes, Charleston's foremost specialist in female nervous disorders. Thomas mentioned he might be consulted if your episodes continued." "But I see no need for that now," Charlotte smiled warmly. "A change of scene, pleasant company, perhaps some gentle social engagements. That's all you need to restore your spirits." As they walked back to the house, Elizabeth maintained her composed exterior while internally recalibrating her plans. The threat of medical intervention was more immediate than she had realized. She would need to be extremely careful not to arouse Charlotte's suspicions while still finding a way to make contact with the abolitionist network. Over the next 2 weeks, Elizabeth settled into the rhythm of life at Pinckney House. She attended church with Charlotte at St. Michael's, joined her for social calls to other prominent Charleston families, and participated in her charity work with the Ladies' Benevolent Society. To all outward appearances, she was exactly what she claimed to be, a grieving mother recovering her equilibrium under her sister-in-law's benevolent guidance. Meanwhile, Esther established her own place in the household hierarchy. As Elizabeth's personal maid, she occupied an ambiguous position, not fully integrated into Charlotte's staff, yet accorded a certain status due to her long association with Elizabeth. This liminal role gave her more freedom of movement than the other house slaves, allowing her to observe and gather information as she accompanied Elizabeth on her daily activities. It was during one of the Ladies' Benevolent Society meetings, held in the parlor of the Pinckney home, that Elizabeth's patience was finally rewarded. Among the dozen or so women sorting donated clothing for the city's white poor, one caught her attention. Not for her appearance, which was as unremarkable as her conversation, but for the small cross-shaped pin she wore at her throat. The design matched exactly the description of a recognition symbol Elizabeth had been told to look for by her Philadelphia contacts. After the meeting, as the ladies were enjoying refreshments, Elizabeth managed to position herself next to the woman who had been introduced as Mrs. Helen Bradford, wife of a shipping merchant. "What lovely needlework on your pin, Mrs. Bradford," Elizabeth commented quietly. "The craftsmanship reminds me of pieces I admired in Philadelphia last year." Mrs. Bradford's eyes flickered briefly to Elizabeth's face, a momentary sharpening of attention that was quickly masked. "Thank you, Mrs. Montgomery. It was a gift from a dear friend in the North. Do you visit Philadelphia often?" "Not as often as I would like," Elizabeth replied. "My last visit was particularly memorable. I attended a most inspiring sermon at a Quaker meeting house there. The minister spoke eloquently on Galatians 3:28. It was the coded reference they had been instructed to use, a specific Bible verse that spoke of there being neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Mrs. Bradford's expression remained pleasant, but a new wariness entered her eyes. An interesting choice of text, not one commonly preached upon in our churches here. Perhaps that's why it made such an impression on me. Elizabeth maintained a mild smile. I've been reflecting on it ever since, especially in light of recent family discussions. Theological discourse can be so enriching, Mrs. Bradford responded carefully, though one must always be mindful of the practical applications of Scripture in our particular context. The exchange was brief, seemingly innocuous to anyone overhearing it, but Elizabeth was certain the message had been received. Now she would have to wait to see if Mrs. Bradford would act upon it, or if she had been too cautious to acknowledge a stranger making abolitionist overtures. That evening, as Esther helped her prepare for bed, Elizabeth recounted the interaction in hushed tones. "Do you think she'll make contact?" Esther asked, brushing Elizabeth's hair with long practiced strokes. "I don't know," Elizabeth admitted. She was understandably cautious. "But she recognized the reference. I'm certain of it." Esther set down the brush. "And if she doesn't respond, or worse, if she reports your approach to others?" Elizabeth met Esther's eyes in the mirror. "Then we'll find another way. There must be multiple cells operating in a city this size. If Mrs. Bradford isn't our connection, someone else will be." The following afternoon, Elizabeth's patience was rewarded. Agnes approached her in the garden where she was reading, her manner formal, but her voice low. "Mrs. Montgomery, a package has arrived for you from Madame Delacroix's dress shop." The messenger says it requires your personal inspection before he can leave it. Elizabeth closed her book, recognizing the unusual message for what it was. Thank you, Agnes. Where is this messenger? At the service entrance, ma'am. Shall I have him bring the package to the parlour? No, that won't be necessary. I'll come see it myself. Elizabeth rose, keeping her movements unhurried despite her racing heart. Is Mrs. Pinkney at home? No, ma'am. She's attending her weekly meeting with Reverend Hammond regarding the church restoration fund. Perfect timing. Elizabeth made her way through the house to the rear entrance, where a young black man in nondescript clothing waited, a wrapped parcel in his hands. You have something for me? She asked, conscious of Agnes hovering nearby. Yes, ma'am. From Madame Delacroix. She says the fabric samples need your approval before she can begin work on your new dress. His eyes held hers steadily, conveying a message beyond his words. Elizabeth nodded, taking the package. Please tell Madame I appreciate her sending these so promptly. I'll review them and send word of my decision. The messenger bowed slightly and departed. Agnes, apparently satisfied that nothing unusual had occurred, returned to her duties, leaving Elizabeth alone with the parcel. In the privacy of her room, with Esther standing watch at the door, Elizabeth carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was indeed a selection of fabric swatches, a convincing cover, but beneath them lay a folded note, written in a neat, feminine hand. Friend, your interest in Philadelphia sermons has been noted. If you wish to continue the discussion, come to Madame Delacroix's shop on Meeting Street tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Ask to see the special collection in the back room. Bring your maid if she is trustworthy, leave her behind if she is not. Destroy this note immediately. H.B. Elizabeth showed the note to Esther, who read it quickly before taking it to the fireplace, where a small fire burned despite the warm day. She fed the paper to the flames, watching until it was completely consumed. So, Mrs. Bradford did understand, Esther said quietly. Yes. Elizabeth's voice was tight with suppressed excitement. And now we'll see if my journey from Twin Oaks was in vain, or if it truly was the beginning of something meaningful. The following day, Elizabeth informed Charlotte that she wished to order some new dresses, having left many of her good gowns at Twin Oaks. Madame Delacroix was recommended to me by Mrs. Bradford, she explained over breakfast. Apparently, her work is exceptional. Charlotte nodded approvingly. Indeed it is. She dresses half the ladies of Charleston society. I'm pleased to see you taking an interest in your appearance again, Elizabeth. It's a positive sign of recovery. I thought so too, Elizabeth agreed with a smile. Esther will accompany me, of course. We should return in time for tea. Deuce. The dress shop on Meeting Street was elegant but understated, its windows displaying the latest Parisian fashions adapted for southern tastes and climate. Inside, the front salon was arranged with comfortable chairs where ladies could browse pattern books and fabric samples while being served tea or sherry by discreet attendants. Madame Delacroix herself greeted Elizabeth, a striking woman of indeterminate age whose French accent seemed to slip occasionally, suggesting it might be an affectation rather than her native tongue. Mrs. Montgomery, welcome, she exclaimed, taking Elizabeth's gloved hands in her own. Mrs. Bradford spoke so highly of you. I am delighted you have chosen to visit my humble establishment. Elizabeth smiled, playing her part in the public performance. Mrs. Bradford assures me you are the finest dressmaker in Charleston. I'm in need of several new gowns for the season. But of course, please be seated. My assistant will bring refreshments while we discuss what you have in mind. Madame Delacroix glanced briefly at Esther, standing silently behind Elizabeth, before adding, I understand you wish to see our special collection? Yes, indeed. Mrs. Bradford mentioned it specifically. Madame nodded, her expression revealing nothing. Very good. We shall review the regular patterns first, and then I will show you the special pieces. It is in a separate room for our most discerning clients. The charade continued for nearly half an hour, Elizabeth discussing fabrics and styles, Madame making suggestions and taking notes, tea being served and sipped. Finally, Madame set aside her pattern book. "Now, for the special collection, if you'll follow me." She rose gracefully. "Your maid may wait here or accompany us, as you prefer." "She will come with me," Elizabeth replied without hesitation. "Esther's eye for color is excellent, and I value her opinion." Madame Delacroix led them through a door at the rear of the salon, down a narrow hallway, and into a smaller room lined with shelves of fabric bolts and dress forms displaying more elaborate creations. She closed the door behind them, and immediately her demeanor changed, the affected accent disappearing, her posture becoming more direct. "We can speak freely here," she said, her voice now pure Boston. "The room is secure, and my assistants know to warn us if anyone approaches." Seated in a chair by the window was Helen Bradford, who rose to greet Elizabeth with newfound warmth. "Mrs. Montgomery, or may I call you Elizabeth? I'm so glad you came. When you mentioned Philadelphia and Galatians, I hardly dared hope, but here you are." "Here I am," Elizabeth agreed, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of this moment, her first direct contact with Charleston's abolitionist network after months of planning and weeks of waiting. "And this is Esther," Helen continued, turning to include the other woman in her greeting. "Your maid, yes, but clearly much more if you've brought her into our confidence." Elizabeth glanced at Esther, whose face remained carefully neutral despite the unprecedented situation of being addressed as an equal by white women. "Yes, Esther is my partner in this endeavor. She has more practical experience than I do, having already helped several people escape from the area around Twin Oaks." Helen's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Indeed? Then you are both more valuable than we initially assumed." She gestured to the chairs arranged in a small circle. "Please sit. We have much to discuss, and limited time." Over the next hour, Elizabeth and Esther learned the outlines of Charleston's Underground Railroad operations, necessarily limited in detail for security reasons, but enough to understand the basic structure. Madame Delacroix's shop served as one of several initial contact points, with Helen Bradford coordinating communications between various cells. The actual movement of fugitive slaves happened primarily through the harbor, with sympathetic ship captains smuggling people north concealed among cargo. "It's becoming increasingly difficult," Helen explained, her voice grave. "The authorities are more vigilant than ever, and the penalties more severe. Last month, a Northern Sea captain was imprisoned for aiding a family's escape. His ship was confiscated, his career destroyed. Yet you continue the work," Elizabeth observed. "We must," Madame Delacroix, whose real name they learned was Sarah Blackwell, replied firmly. "Every person freed is a victory against an abominable institution. Every risk we take is justified by the lives transformed." Helen studied Elizabeth thoughtfully. "What I still don't understand is why you've joined our cause. Mrs. Bradford told me about your situation at Twin Oaks. You're the wife of a prominent slaveholder, sent to Charleston after expressing dangerous ideas. What changed for you?" It was the question Elizabeth had been anticipating, the test of her sincerity. These women wouldn't trust her, couldn't afford to trust her without understanding her motivations. "Many things," she began slowly, "culminating with the death of my infant son last winter. In my grief, I began questioning everything I had been taught was God's will, including the institution of slavery. I read my Bible with new eyes, sought out books and pamphlets that offered different perspectives, and eventually made contact with abolitionists in Philadelphia through a sympathetic cousin there." She paused, then continued more forcefully. "But understanding intellectually that slavery is wrong is one thing. Witnessing its daily reality is another. At Twin Oaks, I saw the human cost of my comfortable life. Families separated, bodies broken, spirits crushed, all to maintain my husband's wealth and position. I could no longer be complicit." Helen and Sarah exchanged glances, seeming to communicate silently before Helen nodded. "And what do you hope to accomplish here in Charleston?" "Your sister-in-law's house is hardly an ideal base for abolitionist activities." No, but it's what I have for now, Elizabeth replied. I can provide financial support. I have my own inheritance that Thomas cannot touch. I can help with communication, perhaps serve as a courier. And Esther, she glanced at her companion. Esther has practical skills and knowledge that could be valuable to your operation. Esther had remained silent throughout the exchange, her face revealing nothing of her thoughts. Now, as all eyes turned to her, she spoke for the first time. I know how to move people safely through hostile territory, she said quietly. How to forge passes, how to identify safe houses, how to avoid patrols. And I have a personal stake in this work that goes beyond moral conviction. Your daughter, Helen said, surprising both Elizabeth and Esther with her knowledge. Mercy, I believe. Still at Twin Oaks. Esther's composure slipped momentarily, shock and fear flashing across her face before she recovered. How do you know about my daughter? We have sources at Twin Oaks, Sarah explained gently. The Underground Railroad doesn't function without information flowing in both directions. When Mrs. Bradford first reported your arrival in Charleston with Elizabeth, we made inquiries. The revelation that the network extended even to Twin Oaks stunned Elizabeth. How many of their slaves were secretly connected to this movement? Samuel, Isaac, others she had never suspected. Then perhaps you have news, Esther asked, an unusual urgency in her voice. Of Mercy, of what's happening there since we left. Helen's face grew serious. That's part of what we needed to discuss today. There have been developments at Twin Oaks that you should know about. Elizabeth felt a chill of apprehension. What sort of developments? 4 slaves have disappeared, 3 field hands and a house servant. Your husband initially assumed they had run away, but after searching the surrounding area with dogs, he found evidence suggesting they had help. Helen's eyes fixed on Esther. He believes you were part of an escape network and that Elizabeth's religious activities were a cover for abolitionist operations. Esther's face remained impassive, but Elizabeth could see the tension in her shoulders. And Mercy, is she safe? For now, yes. But she's being watched closely, as are all the house slaves. Thomas Montgomery has brought in additional overseers and instituted stricter controls throughout the plantation. Elizabeth's mind raced. How recent is this information? The disappearances occurred 5 days ago. Our latest report came yesterday via a sympathetic freedman who delivers goods to Twin Oaks. This changes things, Elizabeth said, meeting Helen's gaze directly. If Thomas suspects Esther's involvement, he'll be watching for any communication from Charleston. Letters will be intercepted, visitors questioned. And he may well send someone to check on me to ensure I'm behaving as expected. Precisely our concern, Sarah agreed, which is why we need to decide quickly whether and how to incorporate you into our operations. The risk factor has increased significantly. A silence fell over the small group as they considered the implications. It was Esther who finally broke it, her voice quiet but determined. We need to get Mercy out. Elizabeth turned to her in surprise. You want to return to Twin Oaks? That would be incredibly dangerous. Not me, but we need to find a way to bring her to Charleston. Esther's eyes held a fierce intensity Elizabeth had never seen before. She has your journal, Elizabeth. If Thomas or his men find it, the gravity of the situation descended on them all. The journal contained names, contacts, plans, enough to implicate dozens of people in both Georgia and South Carolina. This complicates matters considerably, Helen said after a moment. Extracting someone from Twin Oaks under current conditions would be extraordinarily risky. And yet leaving the journal there poses its own dangers. Sarah leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. There might be a way. We have a contact who travels regularly between Charleston and several plantations in Georgia, delivering specialty goods. Perfumes, imported fabrics, that sort of thing. She's above suspicion. A free woman of color with the proper papers and a legitimate business. If anyone could get a message to Mercy or even bring her out, it would be Veronique. How soon could she go? Esther asked. hope flickering in her voice. "She's scheduled to leave for Georgia in 3 days," Sarah replied. "But we would need to be certain of our plan before involving her. The risks are substantial for everyone." Elizabeth had been silent, processing the revelations and their implications. Now she spoke, her voice steady. "What if we approach this differently? Instead of trying to extract Mercy immediately, what if we used Veronique to pass a message, instructing her to destroy the journal and then wait for a better opportunity?" Esther shook her head firmly. "No. If the situation at Twin Oaks is deteriorating as rapidly as it sounds, I want my daughter out of there. The journal is secondary." "Of course," Elizabeth agreed immediately, chastened by Esther's priorities. "You're right. Mercy's safety comes first." Helen watched this exchange with interest, noting the unusual dynamic between the two women, not mistress and slave, but allies negotiating a shared problem. "We'll need to discuss this with the full committee," she said finally. "Committing resources to such a high-risk extraction isn't a decision we can make alone. In the meantime, Elizabeth, you must maintain your cover absolutely. Any hint of unusual behavior could raise Charlotte's suspicions and close our window of opportunity entirely." "I understand," Elizabeth assured her. "I've been playing the role of the repentant zealot quite successfully thus far. Charlotte believes I'm well on my way to recovery from my dangerous ideas." "Good. Keep it that way." Helen rose, signaling the end of their meeting. "We'll send word within 2 days regarding Veronique and the committee's decision. Until then, proceed as normal with your dress fittings and social engagements." As they prepared to leave, Sarah took Elizabeth's hands in her own. "Whatever happens, you've shown extraordinary courage in coming to us. Few women in your position would risk everything as you have done." Elizabeth squeezed her hands briefly before releasing them. "It doesn't feel like courage," she admitted. "Most days it feels like the bare minimum of human decency. Too little, too late. That's how moral awakening often feels," Sarah replied with a sad smile. "The shock of recognizing how long we participated in evil without seeing it clearly. But the important thing is that you're acting now." They departed separately, Helen first, then Elizabeth and Esther after completing the charade of dress measurements and fabric selections. As they walked back toward Trad Street, neither spoke, both processing the revelations and uncertainties of the meeting. That evening, while preparing Elizabeth for dinner with Charlotte's guests, Esther finally gave voice to the concern that had been building since their meeting. "If they decide against sending Veronique to Twin Oaks, I'll go myself." Elizabeth turned from the mirror, alarm clear on her face. "That would be suicide, Esther. Thomas would have you arrested immediately or worse." "She's my daughter." Esther's voice was flat, brooking no argument. "I won't leave her there while things deteriorate around her." "I understand," Elizabeth said softly. "Truly I do. But rushing into danger won't help Mercy. We need to trust the network. They have experience we lack, resources we don't know about." Esther continued arranging Elizabeth's hair, her face set in determined lines. "I'm giving them 2 days to formulate a plan. After that, I make my own decisions." Elizabeth didn't argue further. In Esther's position, she would feel exactly the same way. The fierce protectiveness of a mother for her child transcended all other considerations: social position, personal safety, even rational planning. The next day passed in an agony of waiting. Elizabeth maintained her social facade, accompanying Charlotte to a garden party where Charleston's elite discussed trivialities while slaves served refreshments and stood in the background like living furniture. The juxtaposition was more painful than ever now that she had committed herself to the abolitionist cause, yet she smiled and conversed as expected, revealing nothing of her inner turmoil. That night, an unexpected letter arrived from Twin Oaks. Not from Thomas, but from Jacob Miller, the overseer. Charlotte handed it to Elizabeth with a puzzled expression. "Most unusual for Miller to write directly to you. I hope nothing is amiss." Elizabeth broke the seal with steady fingers despite her racing heart, scanning the brief message while keeping her face neutral. "It seems there was a minor fire in my dressing room," she said, looking up with a convincingly unconcerned expression. "Nothing serious, but some of my personal items were damaged. Miller wanted me to know before I heard it from Thomas, who apparently is in Savannah on business." "How thoughtful of him," Charlotte commented, accepting the explanation without question. "Will you need to return to oversee repairs?" "Oh no, that won't be necessary. Thomas will handle everything." Elizabeth carefully folded the letter, her mind working rapidly to decipher its true meaning. A fire in her dressing room, where her journal had been hidden before she instructed Samuel to retrieve it. Was this Miller's way of telling her the hiding place had been discovered, or had there actually been a fire, possibly set deliberately to destroy evidence? As soon as she could retire to her room without arousing suspicion, Elizabeth shared the letter with Esther, whose reaction confirmed her own fears. "This isn't about a fire," Esther said, her voice tight with anxiety. "It's a warning, or a threat." "But why would Miller warn me? He's Thomas's man, completely loyal to him." Esther's expression was grim. "Unless he's not. Unless he's one of the network's sources at Twin Oaks." The possibility was startling, but made a certain sense. Miller had been at Twin Oaks for years, had access to every part of the plantation, and was trusted implicitly by Thomas. He would be an ideal informant for the Underground Railroad. "If that's true," Elizabeth said slowly, "then this letter might be telling us that Thomas is closing in on the network at Twin Oaks. The fire could be a metaphor for danger, which means Mercy is at even greater risk," Esther concluded, her fear palpable now. "We can't wait any longer, Elizabeth. We need to act." Before Elizabeth could respond, a soft knock sounded at the bedroom door. They exchanged alarmed glances before Elizabeth called, "Who is it?" "Agnes, ma'am. There's a messenger from Madame Delacroix with a delivery for you. Mrs. Pinkney asked me to bring it up." Elizabeth opened the door to find the housekeeper holding a wrapped package similar to the one that had initiated their contact with the abolitionist network. "Thank you, Agnes. Please tell Mrs. Pinkney I'll join her shortly." Once the door was closed, Elizabeth quickly unwrapped the package to find, as before, a selection of fabric swatches concealing a folded note. This time the message was brief and urgent. "Committee approves extraction. V leaves tomorrow first light. Meet at shop 9 p.m. tonight for final arrangements. Destroy this." Esther's relief was visible, her shoulders sagging slightly as the tension of uncertainty was replaced by the prospect of action. "How will you get out tonight without raising questions?" she asked as Elizabeth burned the note in the fireplace. "I'll need to create a diversion," Elizabeth replied, thinking rapidly. "Something that requires your absence from the house while I make my excuses to Charlotte." They spent the next hour formulating a plan. Shortly before dinner, Elizabeth approached Charlotte in the drawing room, her face a perfect mask of irritation. "I'm afraid I must send Esther to Madame Delacroix this evening," she announced. "The fabric samples she sent are completely unsuitable for the dinner dress I ordered, and I've just remembered that I'm expected to accompany you to the Rutledge's dinner party next week. I'll need the dress by then." Charlotte looked up from her embroidery. "Can't it wait until tomorrow? It's hardly proper to send her out alone after dark." She'll take one of your footmen as escort, of course," Elizabeth countered smoothly. "And Madame closes her shop at 6, unless prior arrangements are made. It's nearly that now." After a moment's consideration, Charlotte nodded. "Very well, but I'll send Luther with her. He's the most reliable of the footmen." This complication required a rapid adjustment to their plan. Elizabeth smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Charlotte. That's most kind." Within the hour, Esther was dispatched to Madame Delacroix's shop, accompanied by the stone-faced Luther. Elizabeth watched from her bedroom window as they set off down Trad Street, knowing that once at the shop, Esther would find a way to evade the footman long enough to pass a message to Sarah, arranging Elizabeth's own arrival later that night. Dinner proceeded normally, with Charlotte entertaining two elderly cousins who had stopped in Charleston on their way to their summer home in the mountains. Elizabeth played her part perfectly, engaging in the desultory conversation about family connections and social events, while revealing nothing of her inner tension. After the cousins departed and Charlotte retired to her room with a headache, Elizabeth finally had the opportunity she needed. Changing quickly into her plainest dress and darkest cloak, she slipped out through the garden gate, using the key Esther had stolen earlier in the day from the hook in the kitchen where it hung, rarely used, but conveniently accessible. The streets of Charleston were quieter now, though not deserted. Elizabeth kept her head down, walking purposefully like a woman on legitimate business, though her heart pounded with the knowledge that a respectable lady would never be out alone at this hour. If she were recognized, her presence at the Pinckney house would become untenable, and the entire operation would be compromised. Madame Delacroix's shop was dark from the front, as expected, but a faint light glowed from a window at the rear. Elizabeth made her way down the narrow alley beside the building, finding the service entrance slightly ajar. She slipped inside, closing the door silently behind her. In the back room where they had met previously, a small gathering awaited her: Helen, Sarah, Esther, and two people she hadn't met before. A tall, distinguished black man introduced simply as the Captain, and a striking mixed-race woman in elegant clothes who was evidently Veronique. "You made it," Helen said, relief evident in her voice. "We were beginning to worry." "Charlotte had guests," Elizabeth explained. "I couldn't get away until they left." "No matter, you're here now." Helen turned to the group. "We have little time, so let's finalize the details." Over the next half hour, they outlined the plan. Veronique would travel to Twin Oaks under the pretense of showing imported fabrics and perfumes to the plantation mistress, a service she regularly provided to wealthy households throughout the region. Since Elizabeth was away, she would naturally offer her goods to the house slaves, knowing that ladies often trusted their personal maids to select such items in their absence. "This will give me an opportunity to speak with Mercy," Veronique explained, her voice carrying the lilting accent of New Orleans. "I'll pass her a message and small package from Esther and assess whether immediate extraction is possible or if we need a second trip." "What's in the package?" Elizabeth asked, glancing at Esther. "A letter from me, some money, and this." Esther opened her hand to reveal a small iron key. "It opens the back door of the summer kitchen. If she needs to escape quickly, that's her best route off the property." Elizabeth nodded, recognizing the key to a door that was rarely used, but connected to a path leading directly to the woods beyond the slave quarters. "Veronique will return to Charleston within a week," Helen continued. "She'll bring news, and possibly Mercy herself, depending on the circumstances at Twin Oaks. In the meantime, Elizabeth, you must maintain absolute normalcy at Charlotte's house. Give her no reason to suspect you've been out tonight, or that you're involved in anything beyond recovering from your nervous exhaustion." "I understand." Elizabeth turned to Veronique. "Thank you for doing this." "The risk you're taking." Veronique waved away her gratitude with an elegant hand. "We all take risks in this work, Mrs. Montgomery, some more visible than others, but none without consequence if discovered." The meeting concluded with a prayer led by the captain, whose resonant voice filled the small room with words of courage, protection, and divine justice. As they prepared to leave, staggered departures to avoid drawing attention, Esther pulled Elizabeth aside. "If anything happens," she said quietly, "if Mercy doesn't make it out, or if our involvement is discovered, I want you to know something." Elizabeth waited, seeing the struggle in Esther's face to articulate something important. "For most of my life I've hated you," Esther finally said, her voice steady despite the shocking admission. "You represented everything that kept me and my people in chains, the privileged white woman who never questioned her right to own others. When you started your religious meetings in the woods, I thought it was just another form of control, the mistress playing at salvation while maintaining the system that oppressed us. She paused, then continued more softly. I was wrong. Your awakening may have come late, but it's genuine. What you're doing now, risking everything for people you once saw as property, that requires a kind of courage I didn't think your kind possessed. Elizabeth felt tears threatening, surprised by how deeply Esther's words affected her. I don't deserve your forgiveness or your respect, she whispered. Nothing I do now can erase decades of complicity. No, it can't, Esther agreed bluntly. But that doesn't make your actions now meaningless. If we succeed, if Mercy and others find freedom because of what we've started, that will matter more than the years it took you to see the truth. It wasn't absolution, but it was something perhaps more valuable. Acknowledgement of a shared purpose that transcended their past relationship. Elizabeth nodded, unable to speak, past the lump in her throat. They left the shop separately, Esther returning first with a legitimate package of fabric samples to maintain the charade, Elizabeth following later via a different route. By midnight, both were back in the Pinckney house, their absence apparently unnoticed by Charlotte or the household staff. The days that followed were an exercise in patience and self-control. Elizabeth attended church services, charity meetings, and social calls with Charlotte, maintaining pleasant conversation while internally counting the hours until Veronique's return. Esther continued her duties as a lady's maid, her demeanor perfectly proper, while she waited for news of her daughter. On the 5th day after Veronique's departure, disaster struck from an unexpected quarter. Elizabeth was reading in the garden when Charlotte approached, an opened letter in her hand and a troubled expression on her face. "Elizabeth, I've had the most disturbing communication from Thomas," she said, sitting beside her sister-in-law on the stone bench. "He says there's been serious trouble at Twin Oaks, a slave uprising of sorts, led by some of the house servants. The militia was called in." Elizabeth's blood ran cold, but she kept her face composed, showing only appropriate concern. "How terrible! Was anyone hurt? Is Thomas safe?" "He's unharmed, thank God. 2 overseers were injured and—" Charlotte hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Several slaves were killed resisting capture. Thomas doesn't go into details, but he mentions that the young girl, Mercy, I believe, Esther's daughter, was among the ringleaders." The world seemed to tilt beneath Elizabeth, but years of social training helped her maintain her composure. "That seems unlikely," she managed to say. "Mercy is just a child, barely 12 years old." "Nevertheless, Thomas is quite specific." Charlotte's expression grew more troubled. "There's more, Elizabeth. He suggests that you and Esther might have been involved somehow, that you left behind instructions or encouragements for this insurrection." Elizabeth forced a laugh, though it felt brittle even to her own ears. "That's absurd. I've been here with you for weeks, as you well know. How could I possibly have orchestrated events at Twin Oaks from Charleston?" Charlotte didn't seem entirely convinced. "Thomas mentions a journal of some kind, found in the slave quarters during the search after the uprising. He says it contains evidence of your unorthodox religious activities and communications with northern abolitionists." The journal. Despite their precautions, it had been discovered. Elizabeth's mind raced, calculating what it might contain that could be traced directly to her, to Esther, to their contacts in Charleston and beyond. "I kept a personal diary, yes," she admitted, deciding that partial honesty was her best defense. "It contained my spiritual reflections, my grief over William's death, my questions about faith. If Thomas chooses to interpret that as something seditious, it only demonstrates how determined he is to pathologize my natural mourning process." Charlotte studied her face carefully. "He's coming to Charleston, Elizabeth. He'll be here within days." The news hit like a physical blow, but Elizabeth controlled her reaction. "Well, that's unexpected. Is he coming to check on my recovery or to make accusations in person?" "Both, I imagine." Charlotte folded Thomas's letter carefully. "I must say, I'm disappointed that this unpleasantness has followed you here. I had hoped your stay with me would be peaceful and restorative." "As did I," Elizabeth agreed, her mind already racing ahead to the implications of Thomas's impending arrival. "Please don't worry, Charlotte. I'm sure once Thomas sees how well I've been doing here, his concerns will be put to rest." But inwardly, she knew that everything had changed. If Thomas was coming to Charleston, if Mercy had been identified as a ringleader in whatever had transpired at Twin Oaks, if the journal had been found, they were now in immediate danger. As soon as she could do so without arousing suspicion, Elizabeth sought out Esther, finding her in the laundry room, assisting with the weekly washing. One look at Elizabeth's face told Esther something was wrong. "May I borrow Esther for a moment?" Elizabeth asked the head laundress. "I need her help with selecting a dress for this evening." Once they were alone in Elizabeth's bedroom, she relayed the devastating news. Esther's reaction was heartbreaking, a single, sharp intake of breath followed by absolute stillness, as if her body were trying to process a blow too severe to comprehend. "Mercy," she whispered finally. "Are they sure she was involved?" That she was... She couldn't bring herself to ask if her daughter was among those killed. "Thomas didn't specify," Elizabeth said gently, "only that she was identified as a ringleader. But Esther, we need to act quickly. Thomas will be here within days. We need to contact Helen and the others immediately." Esther's eyes, usually so carefully guarded, now showed raw fear and grief. "Veronique hasn't returned yet. If there was an uprising at Twin Oaks, she might have been caught in it." Elizabeth finished the thought. "Yes, that's possible. But it's also possible she's on her way back with news, maybe even with Mercy." The hope in Esther's expression was painful to see. A mother clinging to the possibility that her child might be safe, despite evidence to the contrary. "We need to get a message to Madame Delacroix," Elizabeth continued, focusing on practical action rather than speculation. "Can you go there today? Perhaps with another complaint about the fabric samples?" Esther shook her head. "Not without raising suspicion. Charlotte saw you speaking with me just now. If I suddenly need to visit the dress shop again, she might make the connection, especially given Thomas's letter." Elizabeth paced the room, thinking rapidly. "Then I'll go myself. I'll tell Charlotte I want to check on the progress of my dresses." It's a perfectly reasonable excuse, but before they could finalize their plan, another complication arose. Agnes knocked at the door, entering at Elizabeth's acknowledgement to announce, "Mrs. Pinckney asks that you join her in the parlor, Mrs. Montgomery. Dr. Percival has arrived for your consultation." Elizabeth froze. "Dr. Percival? I wasn't aware of any appointment." "Mrs. Pinckney arranged it this morning, ma'am, after receiving Mr. Montgomery's letter." Agnes's expression revealed nothing of her thoughts on this development. Elizabeth exchanged a quick glance with Esther, whose face had resumed its careful blankness. "Very well, Agnes. Tell Mrs. Pinckney I'll be down directly." When the housekeeper had gone, Elizabeth turned back to Esther. "This changes things. Charlotte is clearly more concerned about Thomas's allegations than she let on. She's having me evaluated by that specialist in female nervous disorders she mentioned when I first arrived." "What will you do?" Esther asked. "Play the role, as I have been doing." Elizabeth moved to her dressing table, checking her appearance and pinching her cheeks for color. "I'll convince Dr. Percival that I'm perfectly sane and rational. But we need to accelerate our plans. If Charlotte is having me examined now, she might restrict my movements once Thomas arrives." "Be careful," Esther warned. "Men like that are looking for excuses to diagnose women as hysterical or unstable. Don't give him anything he can use against you." Elizabeth nodded, squaring her shoulders before heading downstairs to face the physician who held her freedom in his hands. In the parlor, she found Charlotte sitting with a grey-haired man, whose wire-rimmed spectacles and severe expression matched her mental image of a doctor specializing in controlling troublesome women. "Ah, Elizabeth, there you are!" Charlotte exclaimed with artificial brightness. "This is Dr. Percival, whom I've mentioned before. He's kindly agreed to look in on you today." "How thoughtful," Elizabeth replied, matching Charlotte's tone while extending her hand to the doctor. "Though I'm not sure it's necessary." I've been feeling quite well lately." "Nevertheless," Dr. Percival said, his voice clipped and authoritative, "preventative consultations are always wise, particularly in cases where there has been previous emotional disturbance. Mrs. Pinkney has shared some of your history with me. The next hour was an exercise in careful self-presentation. Dr. Percival questioned Elizabeth about her sleeping habits, her appetite, her religious practices, and her female complaints. She answered each question with measured calm, portraying herself as a woman who had indeed experienced excessive religious enthusiasm following the death of her child, but who had now regained her equilibrium through rest and proper feminine pursuits. "And these religious meetings you conducted at Twin Oaks?" the doctor pressed, his pen poised over his notebook. "What exactly transpired during them?" Elizabeth smiled gently. "Nothing scandalous, I assure you. I read Bible passages to some of our house slaves, discussed the importance of Christian obedience and morality. I may have overstepped my role somewhat. These matters are typically handled by the plantation minister, but my intentions were entirely orthodox." "I see," Dr. Percival made a note. "And did you at any time suggest to these slaves that their condition might be contrary to Christian principles, that they might have a right to freedom or equality?" The question was a trap, designed to elicit either an incriminating admission or an obvious lie. Elizabeth chose a third path. "Doctor, I was raised in a good Southern family and married into another. I understand perfectly well the biblical justifications for our peculiar institution and the necessity of maintaining proper order. My religious enthusiasm may have led me to express more personal concern for our servants' spiritual welfare than is customary, but I never questioned the fundamental relationship between master and slave." "Doctor." Percival studied her face, searching for signs of deception. Elizabeth met his gaze calmly, years of social training allowing her to project sincerity despite the lies. "Well," he said finally, closing his notebook, "I see no immediate cause for concern. Mrs. Montgomery appears to have benefited greatly from her time in Charleston. I would recommend continuing the current regimen of rest, moderate social engagement, and the avoidance of excessive religious or intellectual stimulation." Charlotte looked visibly relieved. "Wonderful! And you don't think there's any need for more intensive treatment?" "Not at present," the doctor replied, "though I would like to evaluate her again after Mr. Montgomery arrives, particularly if he brings additional information about her previous behavior." The implication was clear. Elizabeth had passed this examination, but Thomas's arrival might change the assessment. She was living on borrowed time. After Dr. Percival departed, Charlotte insisted Elizabeth rest in her room, clearly still concerned despite the doctor's relatively positive evaluation. This enforced isolation provided an unexpected opportunity. Elizabeth was able to write a brief, coded message to Helen Bradford, while ostensibly recording her daily activities in a new journal Charlotte had given her to encourage positive reflection. The challenge now was delivering the message. With Charlotte watching her more closely, Elizabeth couldn't risk visiting Madame Delacroix's shop herself, and sending Esther would be equally suspicious. She needed another avenue, another ally. The solution presented itself that evening as Elizabeth prepared for bed. Agnes, bringing up her nightly tea, mentioned casually, "There's been a message from Madame Delacroix, ma'am. The first of your dresses is ready for a fitting. She suggests tomorrow at 2, if that's convenient." The phrasing was too specific to be coincidental. Elizabeth looked sharply at the housekeeper, seeing for the first time a flicker of something like complicity in the woman's usually impassive face. "That would be perfect, Agnes. Please send word that I'll be there." Elizabeth hesitated, then added softly, "With my maid, of course." "Of course, ma'am." Agnes's eyes met hers briefly, conveying understanding before she resumed her professional demeanor. "Will there be anything else tonight?" "No, thank you, that's all." Elizabeth waited until the door closed behind Agnes before turning to Esther, who had been arranging the bedclothes. "Did you hear that?" Agnes must be part of the network. She's letting us know that contact has been established. Or it's a trap, Esther cautioned, ever practical. Thomas could have sent word ahead to Charlotte, asking her to monitor your communications. Agnes could be reporting everything to her. Elizabeth considered this possibility, weighing it against the urgent need for information about Twin Oaks and Mercy. We have to take the risk, she decided finally. If Veronique has returned, if she has news about Mercy, we need to know. And if Thomas is arriving within days, our window for action is closing rapidly. The next afternoon found Elizabeth and Esther once again at Madame Delacroix's shop, this time accompanied by one of Charlotte's footmen. Luther again, his stoic presence a silent reminder of the surveillance under which they now operated. The footman can wait in the front salon, Madame declared imperiously, maintaining her dressmaker persona. Mrs. Montgomery will need privacy for her fitting. Luther nodded impassively, taking a seat in the reception area, while Elizabeth and Esther followed Madame to the back room. This time only Helen awaited them, her face grave. "We've received news from Twin Oaks," she said without preamble. "And it's not good." Elizabeth and Esther exchanged glances, bracing themselves. "There was indeed an uprising of sorts," Helen continued. "Though uprising is perhaps too grand a term for what actually occurred. A small group of slaves, mostly house servants, attempted to escape after the journal was discovered. They were pursued, there was a confrontation, and several people were killed or captured." "And Mercy?" Esther asked, her voice tight with dread. Helen's expression softened with compassion. "Veronique reached Twin Oaks the day before this happened. She made contact with Mercy and gave her your package. But when the journal was found and the escape attempt began, Mercy became separated from the main group. Veronique tried to find her, but in the chaos—" "Is she dead?" Esther's question was direct, demanding truth without cushioning. "We don't know," Helen admitted. "She wasn't among those confirmed killed or captured. Veronique believes she may have escaped into the woods alone, but without guidance or supplies. Her chances—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. A 12-year-old girl alone in the Georgia wilderness, pursued by men with dogs and guns, the prospects were grim. Esther received this news with a stillness that was more concerning than any emotional outburst would have been. "I need to go back," she said, her voice eerily calm. "If she's out there, I'll find her. I know those woods better than anyone." "That's impossible," Helen responded gently. "Thomas Montgomery has likely already left for Charleston. Even if you could reach Twin Oaks, the entire area is being patrolled by militia. You'd be captured before you got within miles of the plantation." "I don't care. She's my daughter." Esther's voice remained level, but her eyes blazed with determination. Elizabeth placed a hand on Esther's arm, a gesture of solidarity that would have been unthinkable months ago. "We'll find another way, Esther. We'll send people to search for her, locals who know the area and won't arouse suspicion." "We're already doing that," Helen assured them. "Veronique has activated our network throughout the county. If Mercy is alive, if she makes contact with any of our allies, we'll know." The conversation shifted to their more immediate concern, Thomas's impending arrival in Charleston and what it meant for Elizabeth and Esther. "You can't stay at Pinckney House," Helen stated firmly. "Once Thomas arrives, you'll both be completely under his control. At best, Elizabeth, you'll be confined to your room under medical supervision. At worst, you could be committed to an asylum. And Esther would be sold south," Elizabeth finished the thought, "or worse, sent back to Twin Oaks for punishment as an example to the others." "Exactly." Helen leaned forward, lowering her voice, though they were alone in the secure room. "We need to get you both out of Charleston before Thomas arrives. We have a ship, the captain's ship, leaving for Philadelphia tomorrow night. You'll be on it." The plan was both simpler and more dangerous than anything they had contemplated before. They would not return to Charlotte's house at all. The footman waiting in the front salon would be told that Elizabeth had taken ill during the fitting and had been moved to a private room to rest. By the time Charlotte became suspicious enough to investigate, they would be gone. hidden in a safe house near the harbor until they could board the ship under cover of darkness. "What about my things?" Elizabeth asked. "My trunks, my mother's jewelry, my personal papers." "All replaceable," Helen interrupted firmly. "Your life and freedom are not. You'll leave with nothing but the clothes on your back, just like every fugitive slave we've helped escape." The reality of their situation struck Elizabeth with sudden clarity. She was about to become a fugitive herself, abandoning her social position, her wealth, her entire identity as a Southern lady. She would be hunted, possibly for years. Her name and description circulated to law enforcement throughout the South. If captured, she would face imprisonment or commitment to an asylum, effectively a life sentence given the nature of such institutions. "I understand," she said finally, accepting the gravity of their circumstances. "When do we leave?" "Now," Helen replied simply. "Luther will be told you're resting. By the time he returns to Charlotte with news of your illness, you'll be safely hidden at the captain's house near the harbor." "And Mercy?" Esther asked, her primary concern unchanged, despite the immediate danger to herself. "If she's found, if she makes it to safety, how will she know where to find me?" Helen took Esther's hands in her own, her grip firm and reassuring. "Our network stretches from Georgia to Canada, Esther. If Mercy is alive, if she reaches any of our people, they will know that you've gone north. She will be sent to join you in Philadelphia. I promise you that." Maisky, as they prepared to slip out through the shop's back entrance, Elizabeth found herself struck by the irony of their situation. She had come to Charleston as a prisoner of sorts, sent away by her husband to prevent her from spreading dangerous ideas about freedom and equality. Now she was leaving as an actual fugitive. Having fully embraced those same ideas, her fate now inextricably linked with the very people she had once owned. "Are you ready?" Helen asked, her hand on the door that would lead them out into a new and uncertain life. Elizabeth glanced at Esther, seeing in her face the same mixture of fear and resolve that she herself felt. They nodded in unison. "Yes," Elizabeth answered for them both. "We're ready." And with that they stepped through the door, leaving behind the world they had known, a world built on ownership and oppression, and moving toward a future where they might, if they were fortunate, help build something better. As they emerged into the alley behind the dress shop, the afternoon sun momentarily blinded them, its brightness a stark contrast to the shadowy room they had just left. For Elizabeth, it felt symbolic, a harsh illumination that both revealed the path ahead and made it impossible to pretend they weren't taking it. Freedom, she was learning, came with its own kind of terror. The terror of responsibility, of consequences, of unknown horizons. But it was a terror worth embracing, worth fighting for, worth risking everything to defend, for herself, for Esther, for Mercy, for all those still in chains, visible and invisible, who deserved the chance to stand in that same blinding, terrifying, glorious light.